Before fans, ice, or the blessed hum of an air conditioner, people didn't just live under the sun, they lived with it, because of it, and occasionally in fear of it. The sun wasn't some friendly cosmic lamp in the sky. No, in the ancient world it was more like an overbearing boss who demanded your presence, monitored your productivity, and took personal offense if you dared complain. When dawn arrived, it wasn't so much the beginning of a new day as it was the start of your shift. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Imagine the world before artificial light. Nights swallowed everything, and mornings brought a burning reminder that nature had no interest in employee wellness programs. The moment sunlight hit the horizon, you were already behind schedule. Entire societies woke up early, not because they were productive morning people, but because waking up late meant being greeted by a sky that glowed like an oven preheating. This era wasn't measured in hours the way we think of them. It was measured in some position, and some position alone. People organised their days like obedient workers following a manager's calendar. Morning, tolerable; midday, regrettable; afternoon, survivable, if you prayed hard; late afternoon, momentary mercy. Please, clap. There was no escape. The sun dictated when you farmed, when you travelled, when you built, when you rested, and even when you argued with your neighbours. Nothing heated tempers like the literal temperature. And here's the delightful part. Nobody could agree whether the sun was a blessing or a threat. Some cultures saw it as a powerful god. Others saw it as a celestial bully with anger problems. Either way, it held the same rank in every civilization. Senior management with full authority and no human resources department to file complaints with. People learned quickly that the world wasn't built to protect them from the sun. The world was built by people trying desperately to work around the sun. Fields were ploughed at dawn, markets opened before breakfast, and travel happened when the air was still cool enough not to vaporize your enthusiasm for life. If you were lucky enough to live in a region with early morning winds, that was considered a blessing, a miracle, and possibly a reason to start a small religion. The midday hours were a no man's land where ambition, productivity, and dignity went to die. Even animals stopped trying around noon. Chickens retreated to shadows, dogs stretched out in defeat, humans pretended to be busy while actually strategizing how to get out of the sun without looking weak in front of their peers. And let's talk hydration, or rather the complete misunderstanding of it. People didn't know the science behind heat stroke or sun exposure. They only knew that if you stayed under the sun too long, you started seeing things that may or may not have been real. "The sun has taken him" was a phrase that covered both dehydration and spiritual possession. But people weren't helpless. They developed instincts. Cover your head or feel your skull turn into a stovetop. Don't argue at noon unless you want your opponent to faint dramatically. And never, under any circumstances, attempt heavy labour when the sun is directly overhead, unless you're trying to impress someone or punish yourself. Early humans accepted suffering as a daily subscription service. You didn't choose it, you simply renewed it every sunrise. The idea of comfort wasn't even part of the vocabulary. Comfort was an accident that occasionally occurred during early morning or late evening, and even then you didn't trust it. If it felt pleasant outside, you assumed something was wrong. Still, despite all this, people adapted. Human beings are remarkable creatures. We complain endlessly, we sweat like broken fountains. We occasionally hallucinate during heat waves, but we keep going. Ancient societies didn't just endure heat. They structured culture, mythology, and social behaviour around it. Songs were written about the sun, rituals were dedicated to it. Entire calendars existed solely to predict how much it planned to torment the population each year. In Egypt, Ra sailed his fiery chariot across the sky. In Mesoamerica, the sun needed constant offerings to keep burning. In ancient Greece, Helios rode across the heavens with no concern for anyone's comfort. Even the myths agreed. The sun had a strong work ethic and absolutely no chill, and because people relied on it for survival, they couldn't even be mad at it. The sun grew the crops. The sun provided light. The sun kept the world alive. It was the ultimate toxic relationship, necessary, powerful, and impossible to avoid. So in a world without shade structures, without cooling technology, without a single oscillating fan whispering hope, life was a negotiation with a blazing overseer that never took a day off. The good news? The sun rose dependably. The bad news? So did the heat, the sweat, and the slow realization that comfort was several centuries away. When modern people think of a home, they imagine comfort. Soft lighting, breathable rooms, windows that politely invite the sun in instead of threatening revenge. But if you lived centuries ago in a hot climate, your house wasn't a home. It was a survival bunker, with the structural personality of a fortress and the mood of a cool cave that resented the outside world. The sun was the enemy, and architecture was the battlefield. To understand why historic houses look the way they do, you have to imagine a world where cooling wasn't a switch, a button, or even a breeze. Cooling was manual, architectural, and painfully slow. A successful house wasn't pretty. A successful house was the one that didn't bake its owner alive by lunchtime. People learned quickly that if you wanted to survive long summers, or short ones that acted like long ones, you needed two things: distance from the heat and materials that refused to cooperate with the sun. Enter stone, mud brick, clay, and walls thicker than your patience in high temperatures. These giant walls weren't built for aesthetics. They were built for the same reason people today build bomb shelters, because the outside world was actively trying to kill them. Thick walls absorbed daytime heat slowly, released it slowly, and created small pockets of interior coolness. That's why walking into one of these homes often felt like stepping into another climate zone, a climate that didn't care for sunlight, joy, or reasonable window sizes. And then, of course, there were the windows, or more accurately, the suspiciously small holes pretending to be windows. You didn't look out of them so much as peer through them, hoping to catch a glimpse of the world you had hidden from. Large windows were a luxury reserved for people who enjoyed suffering or didn't understand thermodynamics. Small windows were the sign of a homeowner who knew exactly how rude the sun could be. These openings served three purposes: let in a little light, let out a little air. Remind you that the world outside was still unbearably hot, and unlike modern glass windows, these weren't sealed or temperature regulating. They were open holes that invited airflow while also inviting, well, everything else. Birds, insects, dust, stray curses from neighbours passing by, you name it. But people accepted the trade-off because the alternative was being roasted like yesterday's leftovers. The roofs were another defensive design choice. In hotter regions, roofs were built with materials that resisted heat transfer: clay tiles, packed earth, or thick layers of thatch. The goal was simple: don't let the sun cook the people underneath. Flat roofs were common in some climates, allowing residents to sleep on top at night or dry food by day. In other words, the roof did double duty as both a workspace and a nighttime escape hatch from indoor suffocation. Inside these homes, the design philosophy was simple: let's pretend light doesn't exist. Interiors were dim, cool, and cave-like, not ideal for reading, socializing, or seeing your own hands, but excellent for not collapsing from heat stroke. The darkness wasn't depressing, it was protective. Shadows were your allies. Sunlight was the villain that burned your skin and your optimism. Even furniture obeyed the logic of heat avoidance. Heavy upholstered items that trapped warmth were rare. Instead, people sat on mats, low stools, or bare floors, materials that didn't retain heat and could be moved easily to chase the coolest corner like a desperate cat. Wood was used sparingly in hot climates because dry heat and too much timber mixed about as well as sunburn and dignity. But the true genius of ancient architecture was its understanding of airflow. Builders created small passages, vents, and aligned openings to encourage cross breezes. These weren't modern engineered systems, they were intuitive designs born from generations of people who had spent far too much time sweating indoors. Some homes even funneled air through shaded courtyards or used interior water features to slightly lower air temperature. These were early prototypes of air conditioning. If air conditioning worked slowly, unpredictably, and only when the wind felt like cooperating. What's remarkable is that these architectural designs were not special features but universal necessities. Wealthy households implemented them with precision and style. Poorer families copied them using whatever materials they could find. Everyone, regardless of class, understood the cruel logic of the sun. If your home didn't defend you, nothing else could. And here's the fun part. These homes also shape social behaviour. People didn't lounge near windows because direct sunlight was a punishment. They didn't gather in bright rooms because bright rooms didn't exist. Life happened in the coolest interior spaces, often clustered around central rooms designed to trap coolness like prized treasure. Families spent most of their day in particular corners, not out of preference, but because it was the only spot that didn't feel like the surface of Mercury. In a world without electricity, the house itself was the air conditioner, a silent, immovable guardian made of mud, stone or clay, absorbing the fury of the day so its inhabitants could tolerate it. Was it cosy? Not even a little. But it worked. The good news? Your house blocked the heat. The bad news? It blocked sunlight, views, laughter, and probably your will to live. But you stayed alive, and that's what counted. Long before architects had degrees, rulers, or complicated software that lets them spin 3D models until they feel dizzy, people understood something painfully obvious. The direction your house faced could either save your life or cook you slowly like a forgotten meal. Orientation wasn't a design preference, it was a survival strategy. Your home didn't just sit somewhere, it pointed itself away from danger like a paranoid animal that had learned not to trust the sun. To the modern eye, many ancient towns looked like chaotic piles of buildings squashed together, but there was nothing random about them. Entire communities were angled, tilted, stretched and contorted in response to the environment. It wasn't aesthetic variety, it was heat avoidance mixed with despair. People knew the sun's habits the way we know celebrity gossip. They tracked its path across the sky, understood how it entered a room, and recognised which parts of the house would become the place no one sits afternoon unless they want to dissolve. And because the sun rose in predictable places, builders used that consistency like a cheat sheet. In hotter regions, houses usually avoided facing directly east or west. The two directions guaranteed to greet you with fiery rays at the worst possible times. East-facing meant your morning began with blinding judgment. West-facing meant your evenings came with the emotional weight of a melting candle. The safest bet? Orient the house so the worst of the sun slid past you like an unwanted guest who couldn't find the front door. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about controlling temperature before people even had the words thermal regulation. Builders angled front doors, shifted windows, and adjusted roof lines to steer sunlight away from living spaces. You'll notice that many historical homes have main rooms facing north or south, depending on the hemisphere, because people understood that indirect light was a lifeline. You wanted illumination, not incineration. But sunlight wasn't the only thing ancient builders watched. The wind was equally important, sometimes more so. Airflow wasn't just a luxury, it was the difference between a house that let you breathe and a house that made you question your life choices. A properly oriented home acted like a funnel, catching breezes and channeling them indoors with the sort of grace you would normally only expect from nature documentaries. Builders placed doorways and openings in ways that encouraged cross-ventilation. Picture a house as a giant lung. One window inhaled the breeze, and another exhaled the heat. Except the lung also let in dust, pollen, wandering insects, gossip from neighbours, and the occasional small bird that took a wrong turn. The good news? You caught the breeze. The bad news? Nature entered uninvited. In many ancient cultures, builders developed rules about orientation so detailed they could rival modern building codes. In ancient China, feng shui wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. Facing the wrong direction meant poor airflow, miserable summers, and angry ancestors who would no longer protect you from overheating. In the Mediterranean, homes were angled toward prevailing winds so efficiently that entire towns seemed to lean into the breeze like heat-weary citizens begging for mercy. Some societies placed great importance on the entryway facing a specific direction. The front door was often positioned to avoid the harshest sun while catching wind at the right angle. A badly placed door was more than an inconvenience. It was a sign that you had lost a private war with nature and now had to deal with guests who would enter your home and immediately comment, "Why is it so hot in here?" And then there were communal structures, meeting halls, temples, markets, carefully oriented to enhance airflow and provide shaded gathering places. These large buildings weren't simply landmarks, they were community refrigerators where people escaped the sun's tyranny. Orientation turned public architecture into survival infrastructure. Entire neighbourhoods often shared the same angling strategy. When everyone's home faced a certain way, it created uniform shade patterns across streets. People didn't design individual houses so much as participate in a collective agreement not to die from heat stroke. This shared orientation also meant that when the breeze came, it passed through every home like a travelling miracle, spreading relief and carrying with it the distinct smell of whatever your neighbour was cooking. Even farms and fields followed orientation logic. Farmers knew which slopes avoided direct sunlight, which angles protected livestock, and which barns needed their doors positioned so animals wouldn't faint in the afternoon heat. If you've ever seen an ancient farm layout and wondered why it looks like someone rotated it slightly off-centre for no reason, trust me, there was a reason. Orientation wasn't just science, it became culture. Parents taught children which direction the sun came from, how to read shadows, and how to judge a building's usefulness by its alignment. A well-oriented home reflected intelligence. A poorly oriented one reflected the owner's willingness to suffer. And as evening finally delivered some mercy, houses that faced the right direction cooled faster. This mattered deeply because nighttime was the only time people could truly rest. A house facing the wrong way didn't just heat up during the day, it refused to let go of that heat until the next morning, trapping its inhabitants like marinated vegetables. By controlling orientation, people created dwellings that worked with nature, not against it. Everything pointed, angled, or turned for a reason. Survival. The good news, you face the breeze. The bad news, everything that flies, floats, buzzes, or bites followed that breeze straight into your living room. If ancient architecture had a secret weapon, a quiet, humble masterpiece that saved more people from spontaneous heat-induced tantrums than anything else, it was the courtyard. Not just any open space, but the inner courtyard, the architectural equivalent of a shaded oasis tucked inside the walls of a home. It was the place where the sun lost its confidence, the air regained its will to live, and families gathered to pretend the world outside wasn't trying to roast them like almonds. Courtyards were not optional features in hot climates. They were survival blueprints. They existed everywhere, from North Africa to the Middle East, Southern Europe to parts of Asia, anywhere the sun strutted through the sky like a smug celestial landlord demanding rent. The idea was elegantly simple. Carve the centre out of the home and let shade, airflow, and clever design turn that hollow space into a microclimate, a tiny pocket of weather created by human stubbornness and architectural wisdom. At first glance, a courtyard looks like an empty hole in the middle of a house, but its genius lies exactly in that emptiness. It's not lost space, it's strategic space. This open-air core did what walls couldn't. It manipulated heat. Sunlight reached the courtyard in limited doses, bouncing off surfaces in ways that softened its intensity. As the day progressed and shadows shifted, the courtyard worked like a natural sundial of mercy, offering pockets of coolness that migrated around the space like friendly ghosts inviting you to sit down and stop sweating so dramatically. The shade alone was transformative. While roofs absorbed and reflected heat, the open courtyard allowed hot air to rise upward and escape, pulling cooler air from shaded corners with it. Homes became breathing structures because courtyards gave them literal lungs. The centre of the home wasn't its warmest spot, it was its escape hatch. But the real magic came from airflow. Courtyards weren't randomly placed. Builders positioned them with the same care modern people use when choosing the angle for a flattering selfie. Doors, windows, and hallways all pointed toward the courtyard so that breezes, rare, precious, fleeting breezes, would pass through rooms before being drawn upward by the courtyard's rising warm air. The entire house became a wind tunnel designed by someone who clearly resented sweating. Even the materials used in the courtyard were carefully chosen. Stone floors, ceramic tiles, compacted earth, or smooth plaster helped radiate heat less aggressively. Some households planted vines, shrubs, or even small trees to create shade layers. A vine crawling up a wall wasn't decoration, it was thermal engineering with leaves. And then there was water. A small fountain or shallow pool in the courtyard wasn't a display of wealth, it was a temperature manipulation device. Water cooled the surrounding air through evaporation, turning the courtyard into an early prototype of evaporative cooling. The sound of water also made people believe they were cooler than they actually were, proving that psychological engineering existed long before electricity. Courtyards didn't merely cool homes, they shaped lifestyles. Families ate meals there, worked there, played there, rested there, and, in many cases, carried out their entire daily routines under that patch of skewer. Courtyards were living rooms with better ventilation and fewer furniture complaints. If you wanted to talk privately, you whispered in a shady corner. If you wanted to dry laundry, you placed it in the sunny strip that moved slowly across the floor. If you wanted to complain about the heat, you did it there, because complaining inside was unbearable and complaining outside was impossible. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep in the courtyard during the hottest months. They dragged mats or low cots into the centre and stared up at the stars while praying that a rogue breeze would visit them sometime before dawn. Nighttime courtyard life was practically a cultural ritual. Children grew up playing beneath its shade. Elders passed down stories there. Lovers met secretly in its corners, and pets claimed every cool spot before humans could reach it. But despite all its advantages, the courtyard had one unavoidable side effect. You became emotionally dependent on it. If the coolest spot in your entire house was the open-air middle, you spent so much time there that it became a second personality in your life. People formed relationships with their courtyards, watering the plants, tending the fountain, sweeping the tiles, adjusting the shade sails, all for the singular reward of not overheating. And yet courtyards were honest. They couldn't block the heat entirely. They couldn't control the weather. They couldn't make summer disappear. What they did offer was a refuge, a compromise, a place where the heat softened, the air stirred, and your suffering dialed down from unbearable to mildly humiliating. Courtyards were masterpieces because they didn't rely on anything except physics and patience. They used proportions, shadows, materials, and airflow to craft comfort centuries before technology existed. They were simple, elegant solutions to a relentless problem. The good news? It was cooler here. The bad news? You basically lived in the courtyard now, but at least you weren't melting. Before mechanical cooling, before ceiling fans, before anyone had even dreamed of a refrigerator humming bravely in a kitchen, humans made an astonishing discovery. The ground was smarter than they were. Dirt didn't overheat. Dirt didn't complain. Dirt didn't burst into flames just because the sun felt dramatic that day. And so, after centuries of experiencing the Earth's surface as a wide, open frying pan, people began looking downward, not out of existential despair, though that was also a factor, but out of architectural necessity. Living underground, or at least retreating underground during the hottest parts of the day, became one of humanity's earliest and most reliable survival hacks. And the beauty of it was simple. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature became. No sun, no glare, no afternoon misery, just cool, still air, and the faint but ever-present smell of soil contemplating your life choices. Underground spaces took many forms, each designed by people who had clearly lost all trust in the sky. Cellars were the most common, a staple in homes, farms, and even small villages. These weren't the polished Pinterest-ready basements of modern homes. No, these were rugged, dim chambers carved into the earth, built solely for two reasons: storing food and storing people who didn't want to be boiled alive. They had thick walls of packed earth or stone, low ceilings to trap the coolness, and rarely a window because the entire point of going underground was avoiding light altogether. Descending into a cellar on a scorching day was like entering a different season. Above ground, the wind burned your cheeks. Underground, your breath fogged slightly. The shock alone could make you believe in miracles. People kept jars, barrels, and perishables down there not because it was convenient, but because the earth was doing a better job preserving their vegetables than the sun was preserving their sanity. And naturally, humans joined their vegetables down there whenever the heat grew unbearable. If you've ever wanted to know what solidarity between produce and people looks like, picture a medieval family huddling beside a root cellar, grateful to share the same climate as their onions. But cellars were only the beginning. Some communities carved entire subsurface homes, using earth and rock as insulation. In places like Cappadocia, Tunisia, and parts of China, underground villages formed, networks of rooms, corridors, storage pits, and community space hidden beneath the blistering surface. These weren't cramped rabbit holes. These were fully developed living systems where life could continue without the daily threat of heat stroke. The earth absorbed the outside temperature swings, keeping interiors cool in summer and moderately warm in winter. Nature's thermostat, set permanently to livable. And then there were caves, humanity's oldest fallback plan. Caves have always been the world's original hotels, always vacant, always shady, and usually quiet except for the occasional echo that made you question your sanity. People didn't just store things in caves, they took shelter, conducted rituals, held meetings, and in many cases lived inside them for generations. A cave was a turnkey home with built-in thermal stability. It just came with questionable lighting, and the constant possibility of sharing your living space with bats. Earth-sheltered structures extended this logic into deliberate engineering. Builders buried homes halfway into hillsides or packed earthen mounds around their walls. Roofs were layered with soil, turf, or stone, creating thick insulating blankets that made the interior significantly cooler. If a modern architect saw this today, they would call it sustainable design. Ancient people simply called it not dying in the heat. Of course, going underground came with certain sensory consequences. For one, the smell. It wasn't exactly bad, it was simply memorable. A combination of damp earth, old wood, stored produce, and whatever creatures had taken up long-term residency in the corners. Spending time underground meant embracing a fragrance best described as ancient history with notes of moss and mystery. The good news, cool air. The bad news, you could smell time. Lighting also posed challenges. Underground spaces relied on small openings, vertical shafts, or oil lamps, none of which cooperated nicely. If you wanted to read a book underground, you'd better hope your book had illustrations large enough to identify in the dark. People got used to navigating their subterranean spaces by feel rather than sight. If you bumped into a barrel, it was grain. If you bumped into something soft, it was probably a family member. If you bumped into something neither barrel nor family, well, that was its home before it was yours. Yet even with these drawbacks, underground spaces represented comfort, which was a rare commodity in hot climates. You could nap there without sweating through your own clothes. You could store food without it turning into a science experiment. You could breathe without your lungs filing complaints. Underground meant peace. Not luxurious peace, but survival peace. Quiet peace. I am no longer frying peace. People didn't romanticize these spaces. They used them because they worked. The earth itself became insulation, shelter, cooling system, and refuge. It absorbed heat without argument, offered stability without pride, and stayed unbothered by the sun in ways humans could only envy. When the heat above became unbearable, people didn't pray for relief, they simply went down. And while it wasn't glamorous, it was effective. The good news is cool underground. The bad news You'll smell like you time-travelled, and the walls are judging you for it. Before fashion magazines, before summer clothing lines, before anyone uttered the words moisture-wicking fabric in a retail store, people already understood something essential. Your clothes could say you or betray you under the sun. In hot climates, clothing was never just decoration. It was a personal cooling strategy, a mobile shade structure, a wearable air conditioning unit powered entirely by hope and body heat. You didn't dress to look good. You dressed to avoid turning into a human casserole. For most of human history, people solved the problem of heat the same way they solved most problems, by observing nature and copying it. Animals with pale fur reflect the sun. Animals in hot regions stay unbothered by allowing air to circulate freely through their coat. Humans, unfortunately, do not come equipped with fur optimized for desert living, so they reached for the next best thing, fabric. Because while modern people might imagine cool clothing as something minimal, ancient people understood the paradoxical truth. In extreme heat, covering yourself is often the only way to stay cool, and so, across hot regions, wardrobes took on a familiar shape. Loose, flowing, airy garments that didn't cling to the body but floated around it like a personal cloud of fabric. These robes, tunics, wraps, and cloaks created pockets of moving air between skin and cloth, forming natural ventilation systems that modern designers would later market as innovative, despite having been invented several thousand years ago. In desert cultures, long robes protected the skin from direct sunlight while allowing breezes to pass freely. You avoided sunburn, heat blisters, and the humiliation of feeling your own clothing glue itself to your body. And because these garments covered so much surface area, they turned your entire outfit into a portable shade tent. If you've ever wondered how people could walk across open sands at high noon without combusting from sheer exposure, the answer isn't magic, it's fabric engineering. Colour mattered too. People learned early that dark colours absorbed heat, while light colours reflected it. Wearing black under the sun was practically a self-inflicted punishment, unless you wanted to know what bread feels like inside an oven. Whites, creams, pale yellows, and soft earth tones became the uniform of survival. These weren't fashion choices, they were physics commitments. Breathable fabrics such as linen, cotton, hemp, and lightweight wool ruled the wardrobe. Linen especially became the champion of hot climate clothing, strong, airy, absorbent, and lightweight. The catch? It wrinkled if you so much as looked at it. But if your daily priority was avoiding heat exhaustion rather than impressing the neighbours with crisp folds, a few wrinkles were a reasonable sacrifice. Clothing wasn't just functional, it shaped how people lived and moved. Loose garments required a certain kind of graceful pacing. You couldn't sprint dramatically while wearing robes without risking embarrassment, entanglement, or accidental ventilation that revealed more than intended. People moved deliberately because fast movement meant heat, sweat, and the possibility of your outfit deciding to catch a breeze and introduce you to the entire community. And this brings us to one of the great comedic truths of historic heat survival. Airflow was a blessing and a curse. Properly harnessed, airflow cooled the body, lifted sweat from the skin, and kept your temperature tolerable. Improperly harnessed, airflow lifted everything else. Robes, skirts, wraps, turning public streets into runways of unplanned exhibitions. The good news? Air flowed freely. The bad news? So did modesty. Clothing accessories helped too. Wide-brimmed hats, veils, shawls, and turbans provided shade for the face and neck, areas that the sun targeted with vindictive enthusiasm. A hat wasn't fashion, it was survival gear. A veil softened sunlight while filtering hot, dusty air. A turban insulated the skull from heat, protecting the brain from feeling like it was being sautéed. Footwear adapted as well. In scorching climates, sandals reigned supreme, simple, breathable, and easy to repair. Walking barefoot on hot ground was an instant lesson in why shoes exist at all. So even the poorest households fashioned some sort of foot covering from leather, woven fibres, or plant materials. Anyone who didn't regretted it immediately. Heat did more than influence what people wore, it influenced how many layers they used. Surprisingly, multiple layers of thin fabric often kept people cooler than wearing less. Each layer trapped air, creating insulation that slowed heat transfer and protected skin from radiant heat. In some cultures, people added layers intentionally even in summer because the right combination of fabric could outsmart the sun. Clothing also reflected cultural adaptations to climate. In the Middle East, the keffiyeh protected faces from harsh sunlight and blowing sand. In North Africa, the burnous cloak shielded against heat by day and cold by night. In India, lightweight saris and dhotis allowed for airflow while still providing sun coverage. These garments evolved not as fashion statements, but as wearable engineering solutions refined across centuries. And yet, despite all the practical brilliance, wearing heat's survival clothing came with its share of inconveniences. Loose fabric could snag on anything from door handles to livestock. Running was discouraged, dancing required strategy, and windy days could turn an entire village into a synchronized performance of please stay down, as everyone attempted to prevent their robes from revealing their social security secrets. Still, people dressed this way because the alternatives were worse. Without loose, breathable, light-coloured clothing, the sun became unbearable. Simple fabric was often the only barrier between a functioning human being and a heat-stricken puddle of regrets. In a world without electricity, fabric was technology. Sewing was engineering. Clothing was survival equipment disguised as everyday wear. The good news? You dressed to outsmart the sun. The bad news? One strong breeze and the sun outsmarted you. In the ancient world, daily life wasn't organised around clocks, alarms, or the optimistic belief that humans function consistently throughout the day. No, time itself bent to the will of temperature. When the sun climbed high and the air thickened into a shimmering wall of discomfort, humanity collectively realised something profound. Afternoon was not for work. Afternoon was for survival. And survival often looked suspiciously like lying down and refusing to move. This cultural adaptation became so widespread that it evolved into structured routine. The midday rest, the siesta, the sacred pause during which productivity died, ambition napped, and entire economies quietly admitted defeat. Whether you were a farmer, merchant, scholar, or the ancient equivalent of guy who sweeps things, you stopped working when the sun hit its peak, because to continue meant courting heat sickness, or worse, sweating in front of people who would never let you forget it. The logic behind afternoon rest was brutally simple. The hours around midday were the hottest, harshest, least negotiable part of the day. The air shimmered. The ground radiated heat like a grudge. Even animals retreated. Dogs melted into the shade. Birds disappeared because even they couldn't be bothered. If the creatures that lived outdoors for a living refused to participate in midday life, humans took the hint. This wasn't laziness, it was strategy. Before refrigeration, fans, and indoor cooling, the human body didn't have many defences. You couldn't fight the sun, you couldn't outrun the heat, so instead, people rewrote the schedule of an entire civilization. Morning was for doing things, late afternoon was for doing more things. Midday? That was the universe's way of telling you to lie down and reflect on your choices. So as the sun climbed, households shut their doors, businesses paused, workshops dimmed, and the world grew quiet. Curtains were drawn, shutters closed, and families disappeared into the coolest parts of their homes to do absolutely nothing. Children were hushed with the stern reminder that daytime noise was forbidden, not for politeness, but because any physical activity risked triggering a household-wide heatstroke. Rest became ritual. People lay on mats, lounged in shaded rooms, or curled up in whatever corner their home had designated as least unbearable. Even those who couldn't fall asleep were expected to remain still. Moving meant sweating. Sweating meant misery. Misery meant blaming your family for not enforcing nap time earlier. So everyone agreed it was better simply not to move, and in many places, this daily pause became cultural identity. Mediterranean societies embraced the siesta so deeply that it shaped everything from business hours to meal times. In parts of the Middle East and South Asia, afternoon rest structured entire social rhythms. Daily life wasn't divided into morning, afternoon and night. It was divided into before the sun becomes unbearable and after it stops being rude. This shift didn't just protect physical health, it forged behavioural habits. People woke early, beginning their tasks long before sunrise if necessary, squeezing productivity into the fragile window when the air still cooperated. Markets opened at dawn, farmers worked the fields before breakfast, builders hammered away before the sun turned their tools into branding irons. But once midday arrived, the atmosphere changed. Silence took over, streets emptied, commerce died, shade became sacred, and if you were unlucky enough to be the person scheduled to run errands during those hours, you were considered either extremely brave or extremely bad at planning. Then evening arrived, and with it, the resurrection of society. When temperatures dipped, people got back up and resumed the day they had paused earlier. This is where the second half of the siesta logic unfolded. If you rest at noon, you work at night. Nighttime became a functional extension of the day, especially in places where heat lingered long after sunset. Social gatherings, business board deals, community meetings, even chores shifted into the cooler hours. Dinner might occur long after modern bedtime standards. Children grew up accustomed to seeing their parents working under moonlight because afternoon had already claimed a significant chunk of their productivity. And with nighttime work came nighttime noise, hammers tapping, carts rolling, neighbours chatting, animals finally deciding to be alive again. Society rebooted after dusk in a quiet frenzy fueled by the knowledge that morning would come too soon, and with it, heat's return. Of course, the siesta lifestyle came with drawbacks. If midday was mandatory rest, then morning and evening became crowded with tasks that had nowhere else to go. People rushed to finish errands before the sun demanded their surrender. Night owls thrived, morning people thrived, everyone else suffered, and because day and night both held responsibilities, many lived in a permanent state of being half rested and half melting. But no one questioned the system. You can debate politics, you can argue religion, you can disagree about taxes, you do not argue with the sun. If the sun tells you to lie down, you listen. The good news, rest was mandatory, expected, and universally accepted. The bad news, your workday started again the moment the sun stopped trying to kill you. Long before electricity made cool air something you could summon by flipping a switch, humanity discovered a gentler, older magic, evaporation. And with it they learned that water, precious, life-sustaining, often frustratingly scarce water, had a hidden talent. It could cool the air simply by disappearing. This revelation turned water into the world's first air conditioner, except far quieter, much more poetic and tragically expensive. Civilizations living under relentless heat turned to water not as luxury, but as necessity. If you wanted a room that didn't feel like a kiln, you didn't pray for cooler temperatures, you brought in water and let nature work overtime. Fountains, pools, basins, shallow channels, and even damp cloths all became tools in humanity's battle against the sun. Fountains were perhaps the most elegant solution. In hot climates stretching from Persia to Spain, homes and palaces were built around courtyards with central fountains that whispered, trickled, or occasionally gurgled depending on the state of the plumbing and the mood of the day. These fountains weren't decorative flourishes. They were strategic installations designed to force the air to chill out, literally. As water rose into the air in streams or droplets, it evaporated, pulling heat with it. The surrounding air cooled just enough to transform a suffocating courtyard into a breathable refuge. People would gather near fountains, not to admire their beauty, but because the air finally felt like it had forgiven them. The sound of water even tricked the brain into believing the temperature was lower, which made fountains ancient cooling systems with built-in psychological benefits. Pools worked on the same principle, but with larger ambition. A shallow pool could create an entire microclimate, gently lowering the temperature of the space around it. Palaces with elaborate water gardens, like those in Moorish Spain or Mughal India, weren't flaunting wealth. They were flaunting tolerable living conditions. When the sun pressed down on stone, the pool pressed back, sending up invisible waves of cooler air. Walking beside one was like strolling through a thin, refreshing veil, draped across the heat. But fountains and pools weren't always accessible. Most people didn't have a palace. Many didn't have a courtyard. Some barely had a bucket. So they turned to the simplest version of evaporative cooling: wet surfaces, splash water on the ground, and as it evaporates, the nearby air becomes momentarily cooler. This meant that in many hot societies, the daily routine included pouring water onto floors, walls, or doorsteps. Not for cleaning, though that was an accidental perk, but for temperature control. Households learned the timing of heat the way modern people learn the timing of traffic lights. When the sun tilted too high, someone fetched a jug or a ladle, flung water across the ground, and let the earth do the rest. The cooling lasted minutes, maybe a bit longer if the shade cooperated, but when you lived in a furnace, every minute mattered. Some communities engineered entire systems around this principle. In ancient Persia, qanats, underground water channels, fed water into homes and gardens, where it could be released into pools or cisterns for cooling. The windcatcher towers above the houses funneled breezes over the water, creating astonishingly cool rooms without a single moving part. This combination of architecture and evaporation formed a natural refrigerator that modern engineers look at and whisper, "We should bring that back." But while the wealthy enjoyed fountains and the middle classes enjoyed damp floors, everyone shared the same fundamental problem. Water was valuable. In hot climates, it was sacred, rationed, sometimes fought over, and always needed for drinking. Every drop spent cooling the air was a drop not used for cooking, cleaning, or feeding animals, so using water for comfort wasn't a casual choice. It was one people made with the solemnity of sacrifice. You weren't pouring water onto stone, you were pouring away something your entire household relied on. The air might cool, but someone in the background was definitely muttering, "This had better be worth it." Even so, water's ability to soothe the atmosphere made it irresistible. When temperatures soared to unbearable heights, priorities shifted. People still drank water, but they also used it to create at least one room, one corner of one room, where they could sit and pretend the climate hadn't declared war on them. A bowl of water placed under a breeze became a humble cooling unit. A wet cloth hung across a doorway turned into a miraculous curtain of chilled air. And yes, this system had its flaws. Evaporative cooling worked best in dry climates. In humid regions, it made the air sticky and sometimes encouraged mold colonies ambitious enough to launch their own civilizations. Still, nobody complained. You can't complain when your alternative is sitting in a heat trap designed by the sun. But the relationship between water and heat was always bittersweet. Water cooled the air, but it vanished in the process. A fountain meant comfort, but it also meant gallons evaporating into the sky. Every splash, every ripple, every shimmering droplet was a tiny, fleeting act of relief. The good news? The air felt fresh, soft, and merciful. The bad news? That beautiful, cool breeze cost more water than your household really wanted to admit. Before motors, before spinning blades, before the blessed invention of electric fans humming away in the background like tiny angels of mercy, people relied on the simplest, most ancient cooling technology imaginable: moving air with their own hands. The hand fan was humanity's first personal cooling device, and like all the early inventions, it worked beautifully while demanding unreasonable amounts of physical labour. The concept was simple: wave something flat in front of your face until you either cool down or develop the forearm strength of a competitive athlete. Fans came in every material you can imagine: woven palm leaves, strips of cloth mounted on frames, carved wood, feathers bound together with delicate craftsmanship, or even large pieces of parchment repurposed because someone was desperate and overheated. If it was flat, lightweight, and didn't disintegrate when flapped, it became a fan. Hand fans didn't just appear because people wanted luxury. They appeared because nature wasn't providing enough breezes. If the wind refused to cooperate, humans improvised. And naturally, this meant that comfort came at the cost of effort. Using a fan required rhythm, stamina, persistence, and a level of emotional commitment that modern air-conditioned humans can barely comprehend. The main drawback? The moment you stopped fanning, the heat came back like a clingy ex who refused to take hints. You couldn't simply wave your hand a few times and expect lasting results. No, effective fanning required continuous motion, a personal windstorm generated by pure desperation. And so began the universal ancient experience, sitting in the heat, already exhausted, and then voluntarily performing a repetitive arm workout just to feel human again. Using a fan meant accepting that your comfort relied entirely on your own refusal to surrender to inertia. Every breeze you felt was a breeze you made. Every sigh of relief was powered by your wrist. This was self-care before self-care had a name. Fans became ubiquitous tools across cultures, seen in Egypt, Greece, China, India, Japan, the Americas, and essentially everywhere the sun decided to be too enthusiastic. Their designs evolved not just for function, but also for status and style. Wealthy households commissioned ornate fans made from silk, ivory, and pheasant feathers. Artisans painted scenes of nature, mythology, or elaborate patterns on folding fans. These weren't just cooling devices, they were mobile works of art that doubled as social signals. But regardless of how fancy a fan looked, it still required the same amount of physical exertion. A diamond-studded fan didn't wave itself, unless you had a servant to do it for you, but that's a later chapter. Even queens had wrist pain, even nobles had elbow fatigue. A fan didn't care about your class, it cared about physics. Fans created small personal climates. A single person could sit in a sweltering room with no breeze, yet enjoy the illusion of coolness, because a pocket of air was constantly moving across their skin. This effect was immediate and intimate, like owning a portable patch of weather. People often sat with fans during meals, conversations, or long ceremonies where the heat threatened to melt their dignity. Because fans could be directed precisely, they offered a control over airflow that no fountain or courtyard could match. But fans also shaped body language and social norms. In many cultures, they became tools for expression, fluttering to signal excitement, snapping open to show annoyance, or hiding part of the face to convey to mystery, flirtation, or the urgent desire to block the sun from your eyeballs. Entire etiquette systems emerged around them, especially in places like Spain and Japan, where the fan evolved into a specialized cultural symbol. Yet beneath all the elegance was the universal truth. Fans existed because everyone was too hot. The physical work of fanning didn't just cool the user, it strengthened them. You could identify a seasoned fan user by the subtle definition in their forearm muscles, earned not through sport but through sheer climatic necessity. The repetitive motion was a mix of endurance training and arm choreography. Some people fanned vigorously, generating gusts like personal hurricanes. Others fanned slowly and steadily, creating a hypnotic, almost meditative rhythm that made bystanders wonder whether they were cooling themselves or performing an ancient ritual. Eventually, fans became indispensable accessories carried everywhere, tucked into belts, slipped into sleeves, hung from cords, or placed beside chairs as faithfully as modern people place their phones. Losing your fan during summer was equivalent to losing your sanity. Borrowing someone else's fan was considered both a kindness and a mildly intimate act because you were essentially asking to share their personal microclimate. And while fans offered relief, they came with one inevitable comical truth. The moment you stopped fanning, you instantly regretted it. That brief pause to rest your arms, heat reclaimed you without hesitation. The fan was both a saviour and a captor, ensuring comfort while trapping you in the endless cycle of your own movement. Some households tried clever solutions to avoid fan fatigue. Fans were hung from ceilings, attached to ropes, or designed with pulleys to allow multiple people to operate a larger fan that cooled an entire room. But at the individual level, nothing replaced the handheld fan. Simple, portable, effective, and mercilessly exhausting. The good news? You felt a cool breeze. The bad news. Every second of it was powered by your own stamina and increasingly resentful wrist. If the hand fan was humanity's first personal cooling tool, then the fan bearer was humanity's first outsourced cooling service. A walking, breathing air conditioning unit whose salary depended on stamina, obedience, and the ability to wave a fan for hours without collapsing. In a world where heat dominated daily life, one truth emerged quickly. If you had enough wealth, you didn't have to create your own breeze. Someone else did it for you. This was not a small task. It wasn't a charming part-time job. It was a full-body workout disguised as employment. The role existed in ancient Egypt, India, China, Rome, Mesoamerica, and countless other cultures where wealthy people looked at the sweltering air and declared, "Not my problem." Fan-bearing servants, attendants, slaves, or assigned family members were tasked with one goal: move air until the person in charge stops sweating or stops complaining, whichever comes first. These human cooling systems operated in courts, temples, and dining halls, weddings, palaces, markets, and anywhere else where status met temperature. In ancient Egyptian artwork, fan-bearers stand behind pharaohs, holding enormous plumes shaped like oversized feathers. These weren't props. They were functional survival devices. Royalty reclined comfortably, while someone behind them performed a near-constant fanning rhythm that could wear out even a devoted percussionist. Imagine the physical endurance required. You're wearing heavy clothing, standing under the same sun as everyone else, but instead of resting like a normal overheated human, you must produce a steady airflow strong enough to cool down someone wearing jewelry that weighs more than your monthly food allowance. And you must do it gracefully, and without sending a rogue gust that knocks their hairstyle over. This job required focus. A wavering fan rhythm could irritate the elite. Fanning too softly drew complaints. Fanning too vigorously risked blowing dust into aristocratic eyes, which historically did not end well for the servant. You weren't just moving air, you were navigating the emotional climate of people who considered sweating a personal insult. The fans themselves varied. Some were rigid boards with painted patterns. Others were long-handled feather assemblies designed to reach over thrones or beds. In China, circular fans made of silk stretched over bamboo frames became symbols of elegance. But behind every elegant fan was a person with a sore wrist, a stiff shoulder, and the private knowledge that their contribution was the only thing stopping the evening from turning into a heat-induced meltdown. In tropical climates, entire staffs might be assigned fanning duties during feasts and gatherings. Imagine dining with friends while multiple attendants stood at each corner of the room, coordinating fan strokes like members of a strange overheated orchestra. Their job was to keep the air moving while never dropping cherubs carved into ceiling borders or priceless tapestries hanging behind them, because they couldn't even lean on walls for support. And then there was nighttime. Elite individuals often slept under canopies or nets suspended from frame beds. To keep the sleeper comfortable, servants were tasked with fanning throughout the night. Yes, all night. While the privileged person dreamed peacefully beneath fluttering air, the servant remained awake, sweating, and fanning until dawn signaled shift change, or in many cases, no shift change at all. You were essentially hired to stay hot so that someone else could stay cool. The absurdity becomes even more pronounced when we look at ceremonial events. Weddings, coronations, diplomatic meetings all required immaculate presentation. A visibly perspiring monarch or noble could create scandal, suggest weakness, or ruin expensive makeup. So fan-bearers stood poised at every moment, ensuring that higher-ranking individuals appeared fresh, even when the weather tried to expose everyone's humanity. The class divide embedded in all this was enormous. Cooling wasn't universal, it was hierarchical. The rich reduced their suffering by increasing someone else's workload. The poor, meanwhile, fanned themselves or endured the heat in silence. To be cooled by another person's labour was a status symbol as clear as gold jewellery or embroidered clothing. In some cultures, it became an unmistakable sign of wealth. One did not need to lift one's own fan. Of course, some fan-bearer chumbias became highly respected within palace systems. Their reliability, precision, and closeness to powerful individuals gave them influence. Being the person who kept a king cool was strangely enough a pathway to trust. But even then, the job was still the job. Endless arm motion, endless heat, endless responsibility not to let the breeze die. And the irony? As exhausting as the work was, losing your place near the aristocrat meant losing access to the one cool spot in the room. Stand one step too far and you were no longer the cooled, you were back in the sauna, with everyone else who couldn't afford human air conditioning. Servants didn't necessarily dislike their employers. Many were loyal, socialized into the role, or simply grateful for the stability of palace work. But even loyalty cannot prevent a universal truth. If you found someone else for 6 hours straight, you will question every decision that led you here. The good news, your employer feels cool and content. The bad news, you are producing the breeze and melting in the process. Before modern insulation, before ceiling fans, before the sweet bliss of air-conditioned bedrooms, there was a nightly dilemma shared across hot regions of the world. Do you dare sleep inside the oven you call a house, or do you haul yourself outside and sleep wherever the night breeze might remember to visit you? Inside meant trapped heat. Outside meant unpredictable company, some human, much of it not. But for many people throughout history, the answer was simple and universal. You slept outside because the alternative was tossing and turning in a sealed chamber of recycled misery. During scorching seasons, indoor walls became heat storage units. Stone retained warmth well into midnight. Brick radiated like a giant fireplace no one asked for. Clay walls didn't cool off. They plotted against you. The temperature indoors often stayed several degrees higher than outside, and lying inside was like agreeing to participate in your own slow roasting. You didn't drift into sleep, you wilted into it. So people devised strategies. Whole households grabbed mats, blankets, woven pallets, or whatever sleeping surface they owned, and migrated to rooftops, courtyards, verandas, and any patch of open sky where the night air flowed more freely than the suffocating stillness indoors. Rooftop sleeping became not just common, but expected in many hot regions. Houses were built with flat roofs, not for aesthetics, but because everyone knew they'd eventually need somewhere to escape to. Evenings turned rooftops into multi-level neighborhoods. Families climbed ladders or stairways with quiet efficiency, claiming their favorite corners like seasoned travelers arriving at a familiar inn. Children spread out like exhausted cats. Elders positioned themselves near parapets for the best breeze. Adults scanned the sky, calculating the odds of rain, wind, or nocturnal bird droppings. These rooftops became nighttime social zones. You could lie there and listen to your neighbours telling stories, arguing about goats, or complaining loudly about the day's heat, which was ironic because those complaints would resume the next morning as if newly invented. Conversations drifted from roof to roof. People swapped gossip across alleyways. Entire blocks turned into open-air dormitories bound together by mutual discomfort and the shared relief of fresh air. Courtyards played an equally vital role. If you were lucky enough to have one, you treated it like a summer bedroom. As soon as the day cooled even slightly, the household transformed the courtyard into a nighttime sanctuary. Mats were laid down, lamps were lit. Children were shooed away from corners that spiders had claimed long before. For a few hours, the courtyard became a refuge from the oppressive indoor heat. Sleeping outdoors wasn't a luxury, it was climatic common sense. You didn't choose it because it was picturesque. You chose it because your bed inside felt like it was hosting a heat demon. Outdoors, at least the air moved. Indoors, air sat around like a lazy roommate refusing to lift even a finger. But while outdoors sleeping solved one problem, it introduced several new ones, most of them alive. Insects saw your exposed sleeping body and asked, "Is this buffet open?" Mosquitoes circled like tiny whining demons with impeccable timing. Moths, beetles, and other winged intruders fluttered around your face just as you began drifting off. Depending on where you lived, scorpions or snakes might wander through the courtyard with the innocent intention of ruining your night. And then there were ants. Ants didn't wait for you to fall asleep, they investigated immediately. People developed countermeasures. Mosquito nets became prized possessions in humid regions. In drier climates, smoke pots or smouldering herbs helped repel insects, though they also occasionally repelled the humans trying to sleep. Some families slept elevated on platforms, others drew lines of chalk or ash around their mats in the superstitious hope that insects respected interior design choices. Spoiler, they did not. Sleeping outside also meant embracing every sound the world produced at night. Rustling leaves could mean a breeze. They could also mean a stray animal, or a neighbour's goat who had no concept of private sleeping areas. Nighttime became an orchestra of creaks, chirps, snuffles, and distant human voices carried by the cool air, all background noise you learned to accept if you wanted rest. Weather was another gamble. Nights could be windy, dusty, or unexpectedly chilly. A sudden gust could send blankets tumbling across rooftops like runaway laundry. Light rain meant scrambling to gather bedding before everything soaked through. A heavy storm meant going back inside and accepting your fate as a human casserole. And yet, despite everything, the insects, the noises, the unpredictable weather, sleeping outdoors was often the best sleep people could get. The air was cooler, fresher, and less oppressive. You could breathe without inhaling stored daytime heat. You could stretch out without feeling like you were lying inside a furnace with a pillow. For many communities, this nighttime migration became a cultural rhythm. Children remembered summer rooftops with fondness. Families strengthened bonds through these shared sleeping spaces. Entire cities glimmered with small lamps on rooftops, creating oceans of flickering light as people rested beneath the stars. Rooftop and courtyard sleeping also had another peculiarity: waking up. Dawn arrived gently outdoors, accompanied by cool light, early birds and roosters reminding everyone that indoor comfort would soon be optional again. Waking inside meant heat slapped you awake. Waking outside meant you got a small merciful window of calmness before the sun resumed its duties as the world's most persistent alarm clock. The good news: outdoors, you had a fighting chance of sleeping through the night. The bad news: so did the insects, and they were delighted to share the experience with you. In hot climates, shade was not an accessory, not an afterthought, not a gentle convenience. Shade was currency, territory, a battleground, and occasionally a diplomatic negotiation. If water was liquid survival, shade was its silent, stubborn sibling, less glamorous, less dramatic, but absolutely essential. The sun dictated every outdoor decision, but shade determined whether those decisions were physically possible. In societies before air conditioning, shade wasn't just comfort, it was infrastructure. People didn't stroll casually under the sun. They planned routes like chess moves, calculating which corners, walls, or alleys offered a temporary cover. Daily life became a constant hunt for the next shadow, the way modern travellers hunt for Wi-Fi signals. Except instead of posting photos online, you were trying not to liquefy. Let's begin with the oldest and most generous provider of shade: trees. A large tree in the middle of a public space was the ancient equivalent of a community cooling station. Beneath it, markets formed, elders gathered, gossip thrived, arguments cooled or intensified depending on the day, and travellers rested their blistered feet. A tree was a social magnet, drawing everyone from merchants to wandering animals. People planted certain species specifically for their shade canopy, broad, leafy guardians that transformed scorching courtyards into bearable meeting grounds. But trees came with the limitation that they were alive, slow to grow, and annoyingly uncooperative if you wanted them in a different spot. You could not simply say, "I would like shade over here," and drag a tree across the street. So humans invented portable shade. Awnings, crafted from woven cloth or animal hide stretched between poles, became the first man-made shadows. Markets, workshops, and vendors draped them across open spaces like fabric fortresses against the sun. These weren't delicate little umbrellas. They were sprawling, sagging, heroic pieces of fabric risking their threads to shield you from ultraviolet doom. If the wind picked up, the awnings flapped and snapped like sails on a ship. If it rained, they regretted everything. But most of the time they stood their ground, offering islands of shadow in seas of heat. A well-placed awning could save lives, but an awning poorly tied collapsed dramatically, often onto the heads of the very people seeking refuge under it. This was not an uncommon event. Entire marketplaces developed an instinctive reaction to the sound of cloth shifting overhead, one that resembled the modern reaction to a glass about to fall. Grab your belongings and prepare for chaos. For communities with more permanent structures, arcades, rows of columns supporting shaded walkways, became an architectural breakthrough. Seen in ancient Greece, Rome, the Middle East, and Asia, arcades served as long tunnels of shade where people could walk, trade, and linger without being roasted by direct sunlight. An arcade wasn't just a design feature, it was a climate control strategy carved in stone. Entire streets were built with arcaded walkways, not because they looked splendid, though they did, but because they created uninterrupted shade corridors. Walking beneath them felt like stepping into a parallel universe, only a few feet away from the sunlit street, yet drastically cooler. No matter how scorching the day was, the underside of an arcade remained a refuge. Craftsmen, vendors, scholars, and wanderers alike claimed these shaded strips. A person walking through the sunlit road had made a terrible mistake. A person walking under the arcade was clearly wise. And then there were improvised shade structures, rooftop cloth screens, wooden slats angled to block glare, or mats hung sideways from poles to create vertical shadows for those who couldn't afford anything more permanent. Shade, in whatever form, was a survival innovation. Humans engineered it wherever the sun overstepped its bounds, which was always. But shade's value created intense competition. In public spaces, the rule was simple: first to come, first served, no matter how much someone else pretends they reserved that spot yesterday. If a tree offered only a narrow shadow, people squeezed into it with the unspoken agreement that personal space was a luxury for cooler seasons. A few inches of shade on the ground could attract 5 people at once. It didn't matter whether they knew each other. Shade erased social boundaries. You were all equally sweaty. Shade scarcity turned large objects into accidental blessings. The shadow of a city wall became prime real estate. The outline of a building's eaves created a thin, coveted retreat. Even the shadow of a passing cart or camel became a momentary miracle, brief relief before the sun reclaimed the territory. If you think that sounds competitive, imagine midday in crowded towns where everyone instinctively migrated toward the same shaded spots. It was an unspoken ritual. Stepping into the shade wasn't just physical, it was emotional. For a moment, you felt triumph, relief, victory. And then you realized 10 other people had had the same idea and were closing in from the other side. Shade was democracy in its purest form. Everyone wanted it, everyone needed it, and everyone pretended not to mind sharing it while very much minding. Of course, cultures adapted socially as well. Meetings were scheduled for shaded areas. Rest stops along trading routes were built beneath permanent shade shelters. Public buildings were oriented to cast shadows at strategic times of day. Even city planners, to the extent planning existed, considered shade patterns when designing streets and plazas. A well-shaded marketplace could be a thriving hub. A sun-baked one was a ghost town by noon. Ultimately, shade was less about convenience and more about survival. It let people move, work, negotiate, socialize, and simply exist during hours when direct sunlight made everything absurdly difficult. The good news? You found shade. The bad news? Half the population arrived there 3 seconds before you. When you live in a hot climate without refrigeration fans, or the blessed hum of AC units, food becomes more than fuel. It becomes a strategic decision. A single bad meal choice could turn your body into its own personal furnace. Heavy dishes didn't just weigh you down, they heated you from the inside out, punishing you for your optimism. Ancient people understood this intimately, which is why eating during scorching seasons required the caution of a military operation. Food carried temperature, and in a world where everything else already radiated heat, the walls, the ground, the sun glaring at you with personal resentment, no one wanted to add more fire to their internal system. so diets evolved to match the climate. In hot regions, people ate lightly, modestly, and often reluctantly, because the last thing you wanted at midday was a meal that made you wish you had written a will. Let's start with the biggest rule of all. Never eat a heavy meal when the day is hot enough to distort your vision. Rich stews, roasted meats, dense breads, and anything requiring long cooking was saved for evening, winter, feast days, or moments of questionable judgment during the hottest parts of the year. Eating heavily wasn't a show of strength, it was self-sabotage. A person who ate a large midday meal during a heatwave was demonstrating bravery or a complete misunderstanding of human physiology. Instead, people turned to foods that cooled, hydrated, soothed, and most importantly, didn't require much digestion. Vegetables, fruits, soaked grains, lightly cooked or raw foods, and thin broths dominated hot season diets. Cucumbers, melons, yogurt-like dishes, soaked pulses, cold barley drinks, summer greens, and lightly fermented beverages all played critical roles in ancient cooling strategies. These foods didn't fight the climate, they cooperated with it. Hydration wasn't a wellness trend, it was survival. Water sources weren't always safe, so many cultures drank diluted fruit juices, herbal infusions, barley water mixtures, or lightly fermented drinks to stay hydrated without risking sickness. People sipped constantly because losing fluids meant losing mental clarity, physical capability, and possibly consciousness. In a world where fainting dramatically could be either a heat stroke or a social faux pas, staying hydrated kept everyone functional. Meals were timed around weather instead of clocks. Breakfast happened early when the air still had mercy. Evening meals occurred after sunset when the world regained its composure. Lunch, if it existed at all, was intentionally small, more of a polite nod to hunger than a full commitment to eating. Some cultures avoided midday meals entirely because digestion raised body temperature, and nobody wanted to boil themselves from the inside, but eating lightly had consequences. Light meals kept you cool, but they didn't keep you full. People lived in a constant state of mild hunger, the kind that sharpened the senses but frayed the temper. Anyone who has ever been both overheated and slightly hungry knows this combination is lethal. Ancient epics blame wars on pride, honour, and revenge, but realistically, many of those battles probably began because someone skipped lunch during a heatwave. Still, the logic was undeniable. A full stomach trapped heat, slowed the body, and made working unbearable. A light stomach gave you a fighting chance. So people embraced smaller meals, viewing them less as culinary experiences and more as truce negotiations between body and climate. Food preparation also adapted to the heat. Ovens were used minimally in the hottest months. Nobody wanted to stand near an open fire when the air already felt like it had personally decided to ruin your day. Instead, people cooked outdoors or relied on dishes that needed little to no heat. Grinding grains, soaking legumes, chopping vegetables, all could be done without turning the living space into a sauna. Communities developed entire repertoires of summer dishes meant to cool or at least not warm. In ancient Persia, chilled sour drinks made with herbs were prized. In Greece, people consumed light fish dishes and simple barley-based meals. In India, spiced buttermilk, yogurt rice, and cooling mango drinks offered heat relief. In the Middle East and North Africa, fruits, light breads, and refreshing infusions of mint or rosewater became staples. Across the world, people learned that the best summer food was food that didn't make the temperature situation worse. Even domestic animals ate differently in the heat, and humans paid attention. If goats slowed eating, people followed suit. If birds sought fruit and water instead of seeds, people reconsidered their lunch menus. Observing nature wasn't poetic, it was practical survival research. But let's be honest, eating lightly during extreme heat wasn't always satisfying. Meals could feel insubstantial, repetitive, and uninspiring. People fantasized about hearty foods the same way modern humans fantasize about vacations or winning arguments 3 hours after they've ended. A bowl of cool barley mush might keep you alive, but it didn't spark joy. Still, joy was optional. Staying upright was essential. Hydration, however, carried its own risks. No matter how precious water was, people sometimes overestimated how much they could safely drink at once. The phrase "drink slowly" wasn't philosophical. It was a real recommendation to avoid stomach cramps, dizziness, or worse. A body overheated and dehydrated did not respond kindly to chugging liquid like a competitive athlete. Ultimately, eating during the hottest seasons was about choosing not to suffer more than necessary. Every dish was a calculation. Every sip was strategy. Every tiny, unsatisfying meal was a sacrifice made in honor of the simple goal: stay alive and stay conscious. The good news? You ate in a way that helped your body survive the heat. The bad news? You stayed hungry enough to glare at anyone who mentioned stew. If you think modern summers smell unpleasant, public transport, crowded festivals, gym bags for forgotten in cars, then imagine a world with no deodorant, no air conditioning, no chilled showers, no chemical cleaners, no scented soaps, and no polite distance between humans. Now add relentless heat, crowded living, layers of clothing, and the ancient belief that frequent bathing could kill you. Congratulations! You have unlocked historical summertime reality, a sensory experience so overwhelming it could have been classified as a weapon. Summer wasn't just hot. It was aromatic in ways that defy polite description. Heat magnified everything. Sweat, dirt, food waste, livestock, stagnant water, fish markets, leather workshops, even the human ego. Smells didn't drift lazily. They marched, aggressively, like they had something to prove. People didn't just perspire. They released entire biographies through their pores. Let's begin with the human body. Sweat is natural, but in a world without regular bathing, it became something closer to an autobiographical statement. After a day in the heat, your body told the entire village what you'd eaten, where you'd worked, and how long you'd been outside. You didn't break a sweat, you announced it. And since everyone else was sweating too, personal scent became communal scent, blending into an atmosphere so thick you could probably slice it and serve it with bread. But it wasn't just sweat. Heat also accelerated the decomposition of everything else around you. Food scraps, animal droppings, spilled wine, unwashed clothing, spoiled milk, fish, too old to be fish anymore, and garbage that lingered because waste removal wasn't exactly a priority in many ancient streets. Many cities didn't even have garbage zones. Trash simply sat near homes, turning alleys into simmering cauldrons of odour. Livestock contributed generously. Goats, chickens, donkeys, and cattle lived close to humans, often inside courtyards and alleyways. And livestock did what livestock does: eat, sweat, poop, repeat. Heat amplified all of it. A single cow in summer might smell like a conversation piece. A herd smelled like a negotiation with fate. Leather tanning districts? These were olfactory nightmares. Tanneries used urine, lime, and animal hides in the process. Imagine all of that in summer. Then imagine living downwind. You didn't choose where smells went. The wind chose, and it rarely chose mercy. Then there were clothes, which lived tragic lives in hot climates. Washing clothing required enormous labour, hauling water, scrubbing with scarce soap, wringing, drying, repairing. Most people couldn't wash clothes daily. Some couldn't wash them weekly. So garments absorbed sweat until they developed personalities. Linen and cotton fared slightly better. Wool and leather garments in summer were character building. Even hair held onto everything. Without regular baths or shampoos, sweat mixed with dust, pollen, and oils to create unique textures that were less beach waves and more historic structural experiment. If you hugged someone, there was a non-zero chance their scent would remain on you longer than the memory of the hug. Bathing habits varied dramatically by culture. Some societies, like those in the Roman Empire or parts of East Asia, washed frequently thanks to abundant water systems or cultural norms, but in many other regions, bathing was infrequent at best. Some people avoided washing during summer because they believed it weakened the body. Others avoided it because water sources were unsafe. Some simply didn't have access. The result? Sweat layered upon sweat until the body achieved a kind of olfactory permanence. Deodorants didn't exist the way we know them, but ancient people tried remedies. They crushed herbs, applied scented oils, sprinkled powders, burned incense near themselves, and even wore perfume pendants around their necks. These remedies masked smell the way a thin curtain masks a thunderstorm. You might cover the top note for an hour, but the heat always revealed the truth. Of course, people got used to it. Humans can adapt to almost anything except taxes. If everyone smelled, then no one smelled worse, only differently. Smell became background noise. Strong odours indicated health, labour, or status. A field worker smelled like fields. A fisherman smelled like the sea and the day's regrets. A noble smelled like expensive oils, layered over sweat, the ancient version of putting perfume on a problem. Cities developed coping strategies as well. Built shade structures over markets to prevent food from rotting at the speed of light. Others spaced meat stalls apart to distribute the smell burden. Some burned herbs or incense in public areas. And many simply ignored the problem because there were hotter, more pressing issues, like the actual heat. Water fountains, where they existed, doubled as splash stations where desperate citizens could dampen their faces, arms, and clothing in hopes of temporary relief. Did it stop the smell? No. Did it slow the fermentation process? Maybe. Did it feel amazing? Absolutely. Summer nights provided some relief, but there was no true escape. Sweat lingered. Clothes retained secrets. And morning returned far too quickly with all the same scents ready to greet humanity like old friends. Heat didn't just melt people, it fermented them. It transformed the world into a giant simmering stew of biological, environmental, and civic aromas. Yet everyone accepted it because they had no choice. In a world without modern hygiene, smelling bad was simply part of being alive. The good news, everyone smelled. The bad news, including you, and nobody had the decency to pretend otherwise. Before window screens, bug spray, insect zappers, citronella candles, or neatly sealed homes, fresh air was a gamble. An irresistible, necessary gamble. On one hand, you desperately needed ventilation to survive the heat. On the other hand, every open window, door, or crack in the wall was essentially a public invitation. Free entry, no restrictions, bring your entire extended insect family. Cooling the house meant cooling yourself, but it also meant feeding half the arthropod population of your region. When temperatures soared, people flung open doors and windows in a synchronized moment of hope and resignation. The breeze drifted in gently, carrying the sweet promise of temporary relief. And then, within seconds, so did a cloud of insects ready to test your patience, your reflexes, and your commitment to staying alive. Ventilation was essential because homes, built from stone, mud brick, or clay, held onto heat like they were emotionally attached to it. Without airflow, the inside of a house became a slow-baking chamber. But ventilation required openings, and those openings became free-for-all entry points. You couldn't say, "Yes, wind, you may enter," but mosquitoes, please stay outside. Physics offered no such courtesy. Air flowed in, anything light enough to travel on it came along for the ride. In many historic houses, windows weren't glazed. They were simply holes in the walls, sometimes covered with wooden shutters that stayed open whenever the heat turned hostile. Air could move freely, but so could dust, pollen, birds, lizards, neighbourhood gossip, wandering leaves, and of course insects who interpreted open windows as personal invitations. Flies were the most persistent daytime intruders. They landed on food, hair, hands, anything motionless for more than a second. A family meal without flies was either a miracle or a sign that you were eating in winter. People waved them away constantly, turning meals into choreographed dances of annoyance. Heat made flies faster. People made slow-motion swatting attempts that rarely worked. Then there were mosquitoes, who truly thrived in this ventilation-based lifestyle. Without nets or screens, nightfall meant turning your home into an all-you-can-drink buffet. It didn't matter how many shutters you half closed or curtains you tied creatively. Mosquitoes slipped through cracks you didn't even know existed. They entered scantily, took what they wanted, your blood and dignity, and left you itching and plotting revenge you would never get to carry out. Other insects accepted the invitation too. Moths were drawn to oil lamps, fluttering dramatically around flames like poets seeking inspiration. Beetles wandered indoors like curious tourists. Ants marched in armies if even one crumb escaped your attention. Occasionally a bee or wasp joined the chaos, because even they needed shade. If you were extremely unlucky, a centipede might saunter across the floor at night like it paid rent. And ventilation rarely worked alone. You needed cross breezes. That meant multiple openings, which meant multiple paths for creatures to enter. Cooling your house became a domino effect of unintended consequences. Open the west window, and suddenly the east wall was hosting an insect meet and greet. People developed coping strategies, though none of them were particularly effective by modern standards. Some hung cloth or woven mats over windows, which blocked the largest intruders but let everything small and everything ambitious through. Others burned herbs or incense near openings in hopes of discouraging insects, but smoke had the annoying habit of drifting directly into your eyes instead of anywhere useful. The insects, meanwhile, barely noticed. Food storage required extreme caution. If you left anything uncovered when ventilating the house, insects claimed it instantly. Bowls were turned upside down, pots were left covered, and anyone caught leaving bread out for even a moment could expect an indoor ant parade worthy of a parade marshal. The concept of leave it on the table simply didn't exist in the heat. That was an invitation not just to insects, but to every hungry creature that wandered by. Nighttime ventilation presented its own horror story. Families often left doors open to catch whatever breeze wandered through the street, but this also let in nocturnal insects, stray cats, curious rodents, and occasionally animals that clearly didn't belong inside. In some regions, scorpions or spiders wandered in quietly. In others, geckos climbed walls like little lizard custodians, doing their best to eat insects, but occasionally startling people into screaming anyway. And yet people still opened their homes because the alternative was suffocating heat. The logic was painful but simple. Better to fight mosquitoes all night than to suffocate all day. Airflow was survival, even if it came with wings. Social spaces reflected this acceptance. Evening gatherings often took place outdoors where breezes were stronger, even though insects were worse. People swatted, slapped, waved, cursed, and endured. In many cultures, entire gestures evolved specifically for expressing insect-related irritation. Tiny hand flicks, sharp wrist swipes, or elaborate arm movements that doubled as cooling attempts. But no matter how many bugs invaded, fresh air remained non-negotiable. Ventilation cooled rooms, dried sweat, carried away heat and stagnation, and made living bearable. The unpleasant truth was that you couldn't have airflow without company. The good news, you got fresh cooling air that made the heat survivable. The bad news, everything that bit, buzzed, crawled, or stung enjoyed the breeze as much as you did. At first glance, the narrow, winding streets of ancient and medieval cities looked chaotic, like someone dropped a handful of buildings from the sky and declared the resulting cluster good enough. But behind the apparent disorder was a surprisingly effective climate strategy. Cities were intentionally built like mazes to escape the sun's fury. When the world offered no fans, no refrigeration, and no relief, urban planners, or more accurately, generations of people who kept learning the hard way, realized the simplest survival technique: if you can't beat the heat, at least block it. And so cities grew upward, inward, and tightly packed, creating networks of shade that sprawled across entire neighborhoods. Tall buildings, narrow alleys, overhanging upper floors, and serpentine streets all combined to form urban shadows, patchwork canopies that stretched across the hottest parts of the day. Cities weren't just built, they were folded in on themselves to avoid direct sunlight. It was architecture by necessity, shaped less by hopeful design and more by desperation. The logic was simple. The narrower the street, the less sunlight could reach the ground. A wide boulevard turned into a solar frying pan at noon, while a cramped alley became a tolerable pathway where you could walk without feeling your skin crackle. Travellers moving from rural areas to cities often experienced this dramatic difference firsthand. One moment they were trudging through open fields, sweating through their clothes. The next, they stepped between tightly packed buildings and suddenly felt, not cool exactly, but less doomed. Narrow streets also forced buildings to lean inward. In many Mediterranean, Middle Eastern and North African cities, the houses were constructed so close together that their upper stories nearly touched, forming natural shade roofs. Residents in higher floors could pass objects or gossip to their neighbours simply by leaning out. You didn't need community gatherings when you had windows 3 feet apart. These crowded layouts weren't just practical, they changed the way cities lived. Streets became tunnels where sunlight only visited during certain hours, if it dared visit at all. The sun could dominate the countryside, but inside the city hid. The city curled like a creature avoiding a predator. It survived by being narrower than the light allowed. But with shade came crowds, lots of crowds. A narrow, shaded street attracted everyone. Children playing, merchants setting up stands, travellers passing through, animals searching for scraps, and residents simply trying to exist without combusting. You couldn't avoid running into people because the street physically did not allow it. Walking in these cities meant accepting that your personal bubble would be pierced repeatedly, punctured by elbows, baskets, goats, and occasionally full market stalls being dragged through spaces that absolutely were not designed for them. Privacy didn't stand a chance. Conversations travelled, smells travelled, arguments definitely travelled. In shade-packed cities, you knew everything about your neighbours, not because you wanted to, but because the architecture demanded it. Shaded streets also affected how people moved. There were preferred routes, known by locals where shade lingered longest throughout the day. Outsiders wandered into sunlit squares at the wrong time and regretted it instantly. Native residents, however, navigated the city like shade-seeking bats, darting through alleys, hugging walls, timing errands so they coincided with the moment little slivers of shadow stretched across the street. Shade had a schedule. People followed it religiously. Markets adapted to this pattern too. Vendors clustered in the shadiest streets, turning them into bustling hubs of commerce. Narrow shaded alleys became shopping districts because no one wanted to bargain for fish or onions while sweating profusely under direct sunlight. City planners didn't design commercial zones, commerce simply followed the shade. But while shade solved the temperature problem, it introduced daily complications. Transportation was a nightmare. Wagons barely squeezed through the tightest streets. Carts got stuck. Animals hesitated. Anyone trying to transport large objects needed creativity, patience, and possibly divine intervention. Moving furniture through these streets required choreography worthy of a dance troupe. Tilting, twisting, lifting, and occasionally yelling at the city layout itself. Fire risk was another issue. Narrow streets, packed with wooden beams, hung laundry, and tightly clustered structures meant that a single spark, an unattended cooking fire, a drop torch, a particularly unlucky lightning bolt, could turn entire neighbourhoods into infernos before anyone had time to react. Shade was comfort, but it was also fuel. Still, the benefits outweighed the risks. Shade kept cities alive. It allowed people to walk, trade, talk, and work during hours when open landscapes were uninhabitable. Even animals understood the logic. Stray dogs, cats, and livestock naturally gravitated toward the darkest corners, napping in places where the sun couldn't find them. Cities also developed microclimates thanks to their narrow layouts. Some alleys remained cool throughout the day. Others warmed briefly, then cooled again, creating temperature pockets that residents knew intimately. People planned their days around these invisible climate maps, where to walk at noon, where to rest at 3, where to haul water without collapsing. And then there was the undeniable social effect. Crowded, shaded streets kept people close, literally. Shade may have prevented heat stroke, but it also turned every outing into an unavoidable social event. You didn't just see neighbours, you collided with them. You didn't overhear conversations, you absorbed them involuntarily. Every errand was a community interaction, whether you wanted it or not. The good news, shade was everywhere, hiding you from the sky's relentless glare. The bad news, people were everywhere too, and escaping heat meant embracing humanity in all its noisy, sweaty, elbow-filled glory. Heat, like a tax collector or a visiting dignitary, did not discriminate. It fell on everyone equally, on kings and beggars, on merchants and labourers, on humans, animals, and anything unfortunate enough to exist outdoors after noon. But while the sun didn't care about status, society absolutely did, and nothing exposed class differences more blatantly than a summer heat wave. Because when temperatures climbed, survival wasn't just about endurance, it was about resources, and resources historically belonged to the few. Let's start with the upper classes, who suffered in theory but rarely in practice. Wealthy households had architectural advantages that ordinary people could only dream about. Thick walls, internal courtyards, shaded balconies, cool storage rooms, fountains, servants, yes, servants, dedicated to cooling tasks. Their homes were built intentionally to block sunlight, circulate air, and minimize exposure. The elite didn't fight the heat. They hired other people, built expensive structures, and reshaped entire estates to politely decline the sun's invitation. If you were wealthy, you had options. You could retreat into shaded reception halls. You could dine in breezy upper floors designed to catch wind. You could nap in garden pavilions surrounded by trees, where vines and foliage acted as natural air filters. You could lounge beside decorative pools that doubled as evaporative cooling devices. You could even leave town altogether, escaping to estates, mountains, or seaside retreats the moment the weather became inconvenient. For the elite, heat was a problem, but one that could be managed with money, design, and human labour. The poor, meanwhile, lived in a completely separate climate zone. While the wealthy enjoyed cooler microclimates inside their homes, the poor lived in structures that were often heat traps, small, cramped, poorly ventilated rooms made of materials that absorbed and radiated heat long after sunset. If the elite lived in architectural strategies, the poor lived in architectural accidents. A one-room dwelling with a low roof and minimal airflow held heat like a personal kiln. The poor couldn't escape indoors because indoors was worse. They couldn't escape outdoors because work took place outdoors. And unlike the wealthy who adjusted schedules to avoid peak temperatures, labourers often had no choice but to toil during the hottest hours, simply because their livelihoods demanded it. Farmers harvested in blazing fields, construction workers lifted stones onto sun-baked sites, porters hauled goods through blistering streets, fisherfolk gutted catches under unforgiving skies. You weren't paid to wait until conditions improved. You were paid to endure them, and endure you did, because complaining did not lower the temperature, and certainly did not raise your income. But class differences went beyond architecture and to labour. They even shaped access to water. For the wealthy, water was a resource used not only for drinking, but for cooling. Fountain, pools, washing vessels, stored reserves. They could afford to waste water on comfort because they had enough to spare. For the poor, water was functional and scarce. Every drop fetched from a well or carried from a stream was precious. Using it to cool the air? Impossible. Using it to bathe frequently? Also impossible. A wealthy person might rinse off multiple times a day. A labourer might wash thoroughly once every few days, or only when work allowed. Even clothing reflected class-based heat inequality. Wealthy people wore light, airy garments made of fine linen or cotton, sometimes imported from afar at great cost. The poor wore whatever material they could afford, often heavier fabrics that trapped heat. They didn't choose what kept them coolest, they chose what kept them clothed. But arguably the greatest divide came from free time, or lack thereof. The elite could rest during the hottest hours. They had the privilege of rearranging their lives around the sun. The siesta was a luxury when your entire workday wasn't dictated by survival. If you were poor, rest wasn't scheduled around climate but around employers. Shade was not a given. It was whatever you could find under a tree, behind a wall, beneath a cart, in a narrow alley where other exhausted workers already gathered. Community shade became improvised real estate for the poor. If the wealthy had courtyards and breezy terraces, the poor had a spot of shadow cast by a building that happened to face west. And because these public shade spots were limited, competition was fierce. People arrived early. They defended their patch. They stayed until someone with equal desperation nudged them aside. The elite rarely fought for shade. The poor fought for it daily. Even sleep reflected class-based heat survival. Wealthy families could move to cooler rooms, open rooftop terraces designed intentionally for nighttime comfort, or rooms with multiple openings for cross breezes. The poor slept wherever they could, on rooftops crowded with neighbours, in courtyards full of insects, or inside rooms that remained unbearably hot until dawn. And yet, with all these disparities, there was a peculiar irony. Even the wealthy could not escape the heat completely. The sun humbled everyone eventually. Silk robes stuck to noble skin just as stubbornly as coarse tunics stuck to labourers. Even in the coolest rooms of the coolest villas, sweat trickled down aristocratic backs. Servants might fan their masters for hours, but no amount of waving could erase summer entirely. Still, the divide remained clear. The wealthy fought heat with architecture, labour, and planning. The poor fought it with resilience, improvisation, and acceptance. Temperature didn't care about class, but the world built around temperature certainly did. The good news, the rich stayed cool. The bad news, if you're reading this as a historical commoner, you definitely weren't rich. In the eras before climate-controlled offices, ice water dispensers, labour safety laws, hydration reminders, or the radical idea that heat stroke is bad, work didn't stop for weather. Heat waves didn't cancel shifts. Scorching days didn't grant exemptions. There was no cheerful announcement saying, due to extreme temperatures, all workers may go home early. No, if anything, the heat simply meant you'd sweat more while doing the same job for the same pay. And if you fainted, your employer might offer sympathy before asking how soon you could get back to work. For most of human history, working through extreme heat wasn't heroic. It was mandatory. The seasons dictated the schedule. Crops had to be harvested when crops were ready, not when the weather was agreeable. Building projects didn't pause because the sun decided to transform the job site into a solar oven. Fishermen didn't get to wait for cool breezes. Miners, shepherds, porters, traders, cooks, metalworkers, sailors, everyone kept going because survival depended on it. Whether you worked in fields, workshops, markets, quarries, kitchens, or caravans, the same enemy hovered above you. A relentless, blazing sun that wanted to know, personally, if you were truly committed to your job. Let's start with outdoor labourers, who bore the worst of it. Farmers didn't just wake early because it was peaceful. They woke early because the heat threatened to kill them by noon. They ploughed, planted, weeded, and reaped with sweat pouring down their backs, soaking through tunics, dripping into eyes, and turning soil into muddy paste beneath their feet. Rest breaks were brief and strategic, just long enough to gulp water or wipe a forehead before returning to fields that radiated heat like open furnaces. Construction workers faced similar torment, lifting stones, mixing mortar, hauling timber. Every task demanded physical effort, and every effort invited more heat. Buildings under construction had no shade, scaffolding baked in the sun. Tools became too hot to touch. Workers adapted by wrapping cloths around handles, covering their heads with anything available, and taking short, furtive breaks in the narrow shadows cast by unfinished walls. But deadlines didn't wait for cooler weather. If the structure needed to rise, workers rose with it, even if their energy levels strongly disagreed. Then there were the traders and porters who spent long days moving goods along dusty roads. Carrying loads under the sun was not a job. It was a constant negotiation with your own misery. Sweat turned clothing into second skin, Chafing turned walking into agony, and by midday, even animals slowed their pace. But trade depended on movement. If you stopped, so did your income. So you endured step by step, heatwave after heatwave. Indoor labourers fared little better. Kitchens in the summer were exercises in human endurance. Imagine cooking over open flames while the temperature outside is already unbearable. Now imagine that inside those kitchens, there were no fans, no cold storage, no ventilation beyond a small window that let in a faint breeze, along with flies. Cooks sweated into pots. Bread baked faster than intended. Tempers rose with the temperature. Metal workers suffered in ways poetic enough to be tragic. Their entire profession revolved around fire. Working the forge in summer meant standing mere inches from a blazing heat source, while the sun roasted you from behind. These workers became immune to discomfort, mostly because they no longer remembered what comfort felt like. Even those with lighter jobs worked through the heat. Market vendors stood for hours under makeshift awnings, swatting at insects while selling goods that spoiled faster in extreme temperatures. Scribes wrote in dim rooms thick with hot, stale air. Merchants travelled in caravans where the heat turned wagons into rolling furnaces. And through all of this, survival depended on endurance. You couldn't say no to heat, because you couldn't say no to work. If you wanted to eat, you worked. If you wanted your family to survive, you worked harder. If the weather was unbearable, you simply bore it. People didn't push through heat. They carried it with them, on their skin, in their lungs, in every movement. Workers developed techniques to cope, though none were foolproof. Soaked cloths draped over heads, taking advantage of rare breezes, drinking water whenever possible, though not too much at once because the body had opinions. Short breaks in slivers of shade, loose clothing that allowed airflow. Community wells where labourers gathered briefly to splash water on their faces before trudging back to their duties. Some regions also adjusted working hours, shifting the heaviest labour into mornings and evenings, but not everywhere could afford such flexibility. Seasons dictated agricultural labour. Trade routes dictated travel. Construction deadlines dictated manpower. A saying across many cultures captured the reality well. The sun doesn't wait. Nor did employers. And so the great truth of pre-modern labour emerged. The environment shaped workers' bodies. People grew strong not through exercise routines, but through hauling stone under punishing sunlight. They developed endurance not in gyms, but in fields that showed no mercy. Their scars, calluses, sun-darkened skin and deep lines etched from squinting all testified to a lifetime of working through heat that modern humans complain about after 5 minutes. Heat didn't excuse deadlines. Heat didn't stop work. Heat simply added another layer of difficulties to lives already defined by difficulty. The good news? Work continues. You keep earning, surviving, pushing forward. The bad news? The heat continues too, and it has no intention of giving you a single day off. In the days before medical science discovered things like dehydration, organ failure, or the radical concept that the human body has limits, people treated heat illness with a mix of superstition, wild guesses, and resigned acceptance. Sunstroke was not understood as a predictable physiological response. It was a mysterious attack, a sudden betrayal by your own body or, depending on local beliefs, the sun losing its temper and smiting someone out of boredom. Symptoms were easy to see and terrifying to witness. A worker might slow down, stumble, turn pale, or flush bright red. Their thoughts blurred, their words slurred, their steps faltered. And then, as if performing in a tragic play, they simply collapsed. Sometimes trembling, sometimes unconscious, sometimes frighteningly still. Everyone recognized the pattern, but no one knew what caused it. Worse, no one agreed on what to do about it. Some cultures believed the sun had literally entered the victim's head. Others thought evil spirits were trying to escape through the skull. Still others assumed the person had simply angered fate, the gods, or their ancestors. Medical knowledge at the time was creative, inconsistent, and frequently wrong. But in the absence of air conditioning, electrolyte drinks, or even a basic understanding of hydration, people had to act anyway. One common response was to drag the stricken person into shade, an instinctive act that often helped, but whose effectiveness people attributed to divine mercy, not environmental relief. Others believed the key was cooling the head, so they splashed water onto the skull or pressed damp cloths against the forehead. Sometimes this worked, sometimes the water was warm, sometimes the water made everything worse because it came from a questionable source. But people kept trying because doing something felt better than doing nothing. In some regions, the solution was counterintuitive, heating the victim further. The logic was baffling by the modern standards, but deeply rooted in ancient humoral theory. If a person collapsed from heat, it meant the body's hot and cold forces were unbalanced. In an attempt to restore harmony, healers applied warm compresses, teas and poultices. Yes, warm. You collapsed because your internal temperature skyrocketed, and the proposed remedy was to add more heat. People suffered through this with impressive politeness. Other remedies included pouring vinegar over the chest, massaging limbs with oil, placing onions near the nostrils, chanting, praying or calling upon local spirits in severe cases, bloodletting, because if medieval medicine feared anything, it wasn't blood loss. Sometimes, remarkably, the victim survived. This was attributed to the success of the ritual, not the fact that their body was simply strong enough to recover. But the confusion didn't end with cures. Causes were equally mysterious. Some believed the heat illness came from looking at the sun too long. Others said it was caused by angry weather spirits or by eating hot foods, spices, meats, fats, on a hot day. Some thought demons lurked in open fields waiting to strike down workers. And a common explanation across many regions was simply weakness, which blamed the victim instead of the climate, ensuring no one learned anything useful. Because explanations varied so wildly, prevention was equally unreliable. People wore amulets engraved with protective symbols. They drew charms on their tools. Elders told stories about the sun's wrath and forbade certain activities during certain hours. And yet, every year, workers fainted in fields, merchants collapsed in marketplaces, travellers dropped on dusty roads, and families rushed to revive them without knowing whether their efforts were healing them or confusing them further. Children, too, were vulnerable. A toddler playing outdoors in the wrong moment could suddenly sway and fall, terrifying parents who then rushed for the nearest healer, neighbour, priest, or anyone who claimed to have experience with sun sickness. Remedies for children were gentler but not necessarily more effective. Cool water, herbal drinks, or whispered incantations meant to draw out the heat demon. Animals suffered as well, and humans noticed. When donkeys, oxen, or goats collapsed, it became impossible to blame moral failings. Even the most stubborn farmer had to admit that the sun attacked everything, human, beast, or cart-pulling mule with dreams of retirement. Still, even seeing animals suffer didn't lead to better explanations. The heat remained a mystery, a force of nature that punished indiscriminately. And yet, amid all this confusion, people developed instincts that, while not scientific, were surprisingly effective. They learnt that resting under shade during midday prevented collapse. They learned to offer small amounts of water to revive someone. They learned that letting the victim lie flat helped. They learned not to push someone back to work immediately, unless the employer was particularly heartless, or the harvest particularly urgent. Communities also developed cultural memories. Don't stay too long in the sun, elders warned, it steals strength. And though the phrasing was poetic, the awareness was real. People respected heat the way they respected fire. It was essential, powerful, and always one step from dangerous. Still, without understanding dehydration, electrolyte loss, or the mechanics of body temperature, heat illness remained frightening and unpredictable. Collapse was often followed by confusion, lingering weakness, or lingering fear. People whispered, "The sun nearly took him," as if the heat had consciousness. Perhaps, in some sense, it did. The good news, if you collapsed, someone would try to help you. The bad news? No one had the faintest idea what they were doing. When the world grew unbearably hot, when fields shimmered, wells dropped, tempers frayed, and the air itself felt like punishment, people turned their eyes upward. Not because they expected clouds to suddenly materialize out of politeness, but because for most of human history, the only authority higher than the sun was the heavens themselves. And in times of relentless heat when nothing else worked, humans did what humans always do. They prayed, pleaded, bargained, threatened, and generally attempted to negotiate with forces far beyond their meteorological understanding. Heat waves, long before modern meteorology, were mysterious cosmic events. People didn't know about high-pressure systems or atmospheric stagnation. They only knew that the sun had taken an aggressive interest in their lives and seemed unwilling to back down. When shade, water, architecture, fans, and human endurance all failed, spiritual intervention became the final resort. Different cultures had different approaches, but the theme was universal: appease the heavens, and maybe they'll cool the earth long enough for crops and tempers to survive. In agrarian communities where livelihoods depended on seasonal rhythms, extreme heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was existential. Crops wilted, animals weakened, people fell ill, food supplies dwindled. This wasn't weather, this was a cosmic warning. So rituals emerged. Some communities held rain-invoking ceremonies, gathering at fields or rivers to chant, sing, or dance in hopes of persuading the sky to release moisture. These ceremonies often involved rhythmic stamping meant to mimic thunder, or the symbolic offering of water to the earth, a polite hint that perhaps the heavens could return the gesture. Others lit incense, burned herbs, or offered sacrifices of grain, fruit, or livestock. Some climbed hills or temple steps to pray at higher altitudes, assuming that proximity mattered when negotiating with deities who lived above. The logic was simple. If the gods controlled the weather, then anyone who wanted cooler air needed to file a divine request. Priests or spiritual leaders often acted as intermediaries. In many societies, it was believed they could interpret the sun's anger or the reasons behind a heat wave. They explained the scorching weather using stories, myths, and moral frameworks. The community had displeased a deity. Rituals had been neglected. Someone had committed an offense that required cosmic correction. The sun itself was purifying the earth, unpleasantly. Thus, heat became not just physical suffering, but moral narrative. People repented, confessed, fasted, or participated in public ceremonies meant to restore cosmic balance. If the temperature dropped afterward, even slightly, it was hailed as evidence of divine mercy. If it didn't, well, faith required patience. In many places, rain gods, storm gods, and sky spirits took center stage during heat waves. The ancient Greeks appealed to Zeus Ombrios, the bringer of rain. People in the Middle East prayed to Baal. In parts of India, rituals for Indra or Varuna sought relief. In Mesoamerica, offerings to Tlaloc were common, particularly when drought threatened. These deities received more attention during the hottest periods, not necessarily because people were deeply pious, but because desperation is an excellent motivator. But not all rituals aimed to produce rain. Some cultures attempted to temper the sun's strength instead. This meant offerings of cooling foods, symbolic water vessels, or rituals designed to soothe the sun's temper, portraying it as a volatile, emotional force that needed careful handling. The sun wasn't an astronomical body. It was a fiery deity with mood swings. In some folklore traditions, extreme heat was interpreted as cosmic conflict. The sun was angry, the sky was displeased, or the gods were punishing humanity's errors. This belief didn't help cool anything, but it at least gave people a sense of meaning, which was better than facing the heat with no explanation except, the atmosphere is rude today. Singing also played a role. Communities gathered to chant in unison, believing that rhythmic voices could reach the heavens more effectively than individual pleas. These gatherings had practical value as well. They fostered solidarity, helping people feel less alone in their misery. If everyone was suffering, at least they could suffer together. But perhaps the most relatable rituals were the private ones. A mother whispering a prayer over a wilting child. A farmer wiping sweat from his brow before offering a silent plea for cloud cover. A traveller resting under a lone tree, murmuring a request for wind. Faith was woven into daily endurance, a quiet rhythm accompanying every scorching day. And what happened when the sky finally darkened, when clouds appeared, when wind shifted, when rain began to fall in soft, miraculous drops? Relief washed over communities more powerful than the cooling water itself. People danced, cried, shouted. Children ran outdoors to celebrate. Elders nodded solemnly, declaring that the gods had heard them. And for a moment, the world felt merciful again. Of course, not every prayer produced clouds. Many heat waves dragged on for weeks with no divine response whatsoever. People prayed anyway because hope, like shade, was a resource humans learned to stretch as far as possible. Faith didn't cool the body, but it soothed the spirit. And when temperatures reached unbearable levels, that was sometimes the only comfort available. The good news: you prayed with your community, lifting your fears toward the sky. The bad news: the sun kept shining, blissfully unaware or unconcerned about your requests. Before air conditioning, before insulated homes, before ice could be stored safely without becoming a puddle with aspirations, there existed one foolproof, if inconvenient, strategy for dealing with relentless heat: leaving. If the climate turned your home into a daytime furnace and a nighttime sauna, if the sun seemed to grow heavier every day, if prayer, shade, architecture, and endurance all stopped offering relief, people turned to the simplest survival method available: migration. Not the dramatic, pack your entire life and move forever migration. Most people didn't have that luxury. Instead, they relied on seasonal escape, abandoning overheated regions temporarily and returning once nature calmed down. This wasn't migration in the modern sense. No one boarded a train, booked a resort, or followed weather forecasts. They just followed experience, years, decades, and generations of observing when the land became uninhabitable and when it forgave them. Families, merchants, nobles, shepherds, and workers all participated in seasonal movement, whether short distance or hundreds of miles. When the air shimmered, when crops wilted, when animals suffered, and when people started snapping at each other because they hadn't felt cool since spring, migration became the pressure valve society desperately needed. For the wealthy, seasonal escape was practically tradition. Many aristocratic households maintained summer residences in cooler regions, mountains, forests, lakesides, or coastal areas where breezes blew freely and the sun felt more like a warm blanket than a personal insult. They didn't need scientific measurements. They needed elevation, vegetation, and distance from heat-soaked cities. And so, when the temperature rose, noble families packed trunks, locked up estates, and embarked on leisurely relocation. Their letters and diaries often described these escapes as restorative retreats, though a more accurate translation would be, "We ran for our lives." The poor Psal, however, migrated differently, less leisurely, more necessity-driven. Nomadic pastoralists moved livestock seasonally, seeking higher ground when lowland heat became unbearable. Shepherds climbed mountain pastures, camel herders crossed deserts at dawn and dusk, adjusting routes to avoid the midsummer scorch. Fisherfolk relocated to cooler waters. Rural labourers sometimes followed temporary work northward, or toward river valleys where the air was less suffocating. In some regions, entire villages practiced vertical migration, moving uphill during summer and downhill during winter. Families lived in simple seasonal dwellings, the ancient ancestors of today's vacation cabins, though vacation implies fun and relaxation, neither of which applied. This was survival with a suitcase. Then there were temporary escapes, small but essential. Travellers crossing deserts slept in oases for days, letting heat pass before continuing. Farmers retreated to shaded shelters or nearby hillsides between harvest periods. Market communities moved seasonal stalls to cooler zones. Families visited relatives living in breezier areas. Even a few days away from the heat made returning more bearable. Some migrations were cultural traditions. In South Asia, the wealthy fled to hill stations, retreats deliberately built at high elevation specifically to escape plains heat. In ancient Rome, elites fled to villas in the countryside or along the Bay of Naples. In the Middle East, seasonal tents were moved closer to breezy water sources. Across Africa, pastoralist groups migrated in patterns synchronized with rainfall and temperature cycles. In medieval Europe, mountain communities practiced transhumance, shifting livestock and families seasonally. But while the wealthy fled, the cities they left behind changed dramatically. Urban populations thinned, markets quieted, the social atmosphere cooled even if the physical one didn't. Seasonal migration created a rhythm. Bustling winters, thinning summers, revived autumns, and everyone knew what it meant when the first group departed. It was officially too hot to pretend anymore. However, migration wasn't simple. Travel was long, uncomfortable, dangerous, and expensive. Roads baked under the sun, water sources dried up, food spoiled faster, and travel demanded endurance precisely when people had the least amount of it. Families weighed risk versus reward, stay and suffer, or travel and suffer differently. Many chose movement not because they wanted to, but because staying put felt worse. Animals complicated everything. Herds needed water, grazing land, shade, and constant oversight. Migrating with livestock was a slow, exhausting process that required waking before dawn, travelling at the coolest hours, and resting during the worst. Humans followed animal needs more often than animals followed human plans. Even after successful migration, the relief was temporary. Everyone knew they would return home eventually, because home was where their fields, obligations, communities, and livelihoods existed. Seasonal migration didn't solve heat. It postponed its consequences. Once the weather shifted, families retraced their steps back into the roasting pan that was their real life. Returning home meant reopening shuttered rooms, sweeping out dust, rebuilding routines, and pretending you had briefly enjoyed a luxurious break rather than a desperate survival tactic. People exchanged stories: how bad the heat got, how long the drought lasted, who fainted, who thrived, which crops suffered, which animals survived. Migration provided relief, but it also provided news, a travelling network of overheated gossip. There was one shared lesson across all cultures: avoidance works, but never forever. The heat always returned, and so did the people. Temporary escape did not eliminate suffering, it simply interrupted it with moments of mercy. The good news: you escaped the heat. The bad news: stayed behind, waiting patiently for your return. Long before the invention of thermostats or social media, where people now complain about heat with professional enthusiasm, human beings developed a far quieter, far more ancient survival mechanism: acceptance. Not joyful acceptance, not peaceful acceptance, but the tired, practical kind that comes from realizing the sun will not negotiate. When every day was hot, when every summer was worse, when every afternoon felt like punishment, people discovered a universal truth. Complaining does nothing. The temperature never apologized. So instead of fighting the heat, societies adapted to it mentally, emotionally, and culturally. Endurance became not only a necessity, but a mark of adulthood, resilience, and, in some regions, identity. Children learned early. Sweating wasn't failure. It was participation. You weren't weak because you felt the heat. You were human because you kept moving anyway. Cultures across the world developed philosophies to rationalize the unbearable. Some regarded heat as a test from the gods. Others saw it as a seasonal rhythm, a natural cycle that demanded patience rather than protest. In desert societies, people joked that the sun was simply overachieving. In tropical regions, families shrugged as if to say, "Of course it's hot, what else would it be?" Complaining wasn't discouraged, it was just pointless. Heat did not negotiate with mortals, and so people saved their breath, because breathing too hard made you hotter. Adaptation began with expectations. When you grow up knowing summer will bake the earth until it cracks, you don't wait for cooler weather to feel comfortable, you adjust your idea of comfort. What modern people call a heatwave was, historically, known as Wednesday. When the air shimmered, when sweat-soaked clothing, when the ground radiated upward like a furnace, no one panicked. They simply adjusted pace, posture, and even personality. Slower movements, quieter voices, shorter tempers, longer silences. Communities also developed emotional rituals around heat. People shared stories under shade, turning suffering into conversation. They laughed at moments when heat defeated them. The time a worker fell asleep mid-sentence, the moment someone burned their hand on a sunlit tool, the day a pot of water boiled outside without fire. Humour was not entertainment. It was a cooling mechanism for the spirit. Heat endurance also shaped manners. In some regions, people apologised less because everyone understood that heat drained politeness faster than sweat. In others, hospitality grew stronger. When the world was unbearable, kindness felt like rebellion. Offering someone a spot in the shade was an act of generosity equal to feeding them. Sharing water was practically sacred. Acceptance, however, didn't mean passivity. People developed mental strategies that modern psychology would consider brilliant. Expectation adjustment. Assume the day will be miserable, and anything less is a blessing. Emotional pacing. Save your energy for when you truly need it. Heat punished impulsiveness. Value reordering. Survival tasks first. Comfort later. Luxury never. Humility before nature. The sun doesn't care about your plans. Adapt or overheat. These weren't conscious teachings. They were inherited wisdom, passed down through generations like an emotional survival kit. Communities also developed rhythms that mirrored climate. People spoke less during the hottest hours because conversation required effort and effort generated heat. They shifted tasks to early morning or late evening. They avoided unnecessary movement. They learned to sit perfectly still in shade, mastering the art of conserving every possible drop of energy. Stillness became a cultural virtue. Many societies developed sayings about heat, tiny verbal tools that taught endurance through clever phrasing. The sun burns, but it also passes. He who fights the heat loses twice. Sweat is the tax of living. Move slowly, the sun moves fast enough. These weren't just proverbs, they were psychological shields, reminders that humans had survived heat for millennia and would continue doing so. And yet, adaptation did not erase suffering. People still sweated through clothing, they still felt dizzy, tired, irritable, sticky and defeated. But they did not interpret these sensations as crises, they interpreted them as normal, part of the day, part of the season, part of life. Mental endurance went hand in hand with collective endurance. In hot climates, communities survived through cooperation. Neighbours warned each other when the sun was strongest. Elders taught shade-seeking instincts. Everyone understood the risks of overworking in heat because they had seen the toll firsthand. No one mocked someone for sitting down. They praised them for knowing their limits. But adaptation came with its frustrations. People learned not to complain outwardly, but they definitely complained inwardly. The sun was a familiar enemy. You didn't yell at it, but you certainly glared at it. Quiet resentment toward weather became a shared bond, a cultural inside joke. Everyone hated the heat together. Everyone endured it together. Everyone survived it together. Not every society embraced stoicism. Some developed dramatic displays of heat exhaustion as a cultural language. But even then, after the performance, people returned to their tasks, mopped their faces, and moved slower. Accepting the effort was optional, but sweating was mandatory, the most ironic part. For many cultures, enduring heat became a point of pride. People compared experiences, who worked the longest, who walked the farthest, who kept going while others rested. Strength was measured not in muscles, but in the ability to withstand temperatures that would send modern people scrambling for air-conditioned sanctuaries. Complaining didn't lower the temperature. Acceptance didn't lower it either. But acceptance made surviving possible. The good news? You adapt. Your mind reshapes itself around the heat. The bad news? You still sweat. Always, always. To modern sensibilities, unrelenting heat feels like an emergency, something to escape, mitigate, monitor on weather apps, and complain about with theatrical flair. But historically, heat wasn't a crisis. It wasn't exceptional. It wasn't even noteworthy, unless it reached the point of killing crops, livestock, or people. Otherwise, it was just life. Hot seasons were predictable, cyclical, and accepted the way modern people accept taxes or awkward small talk. Discomfort wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural baseline. For most of history, people lived with very low expectations of physical comfort. Homes were drafty in winter, stifling in summer, dusty year-round and loud whenever animals decided to participate in daily activities. Clothing was coarse unless you had wealth. Roads were uneven. Beds were lumpy. Work was exhausting. So when summer arrived with its annual package of heat, sweat, exhaustion and irritability, it didn't stand out as a unique torment. It simply joined the long list of everyday hardships. Heat wasn't a villain, it was a season, a predictable visitor who overstayed its welcome every year without fail. People didn't ask, so how do we stay cool? They asked, what must we endure today? That psychological shift made all the difference. When discomfort is expected, suffering feels normal. This expectation began in childhood. Children grew up watching adults work through heat without complaint. They learned that sweating was the body's way of acknowledging the sun's dominance. They learned that mid-afternoon meant stillness, not indulgence. They learned that if you fainted, you rested briefly before continuing. They learned early that summer was something you survived, not something you enjoyed. Historical records rarely mention ordinary heat because to the writers of the time, scribes, monks, merchants, there was nothing to report. Diaries described great storms, freak frosts, record droughts, or heat so extreme it scorched crops. But the average scorching summer day didn't earn ink. Why? Because it was expected. The chroniclers weren't ignoring misery, they were ignoring normality, and this normality shaped culture. People didn't structure their days with comfort breaks or cooling periods. They structured them around acceptable levels of suffering. Dawn was tolerable. Late morning was manageable. Noon was terrible but accepted. Afternoon was a test of character. Evening was relief earned by survival. Night was a reminder. Tomorrow would be just as hot. But here's the thing. When everyone suffers together, suffering becomes strangely communal. Misery loses its sharp edge when shared. People worked side by side in fields, in markets, in workshops, all sweating, squinting, wiping foreheads and carrying on as if nothing unusual were happening. There was no comparison, no envy of cooler alternatives, because such alternatives didn't exist. If everyone is uncomfortable, then discomfort becomes the default. Comfort itself was viewed with suspicion, even decadence. A perfectly cool environment didn't just feel impossible, it felt unnatural. People had lived with hardship for so long that comfort was nearly synonymous with luxury, and luxury was for the very few. Besides, before modern cooling technology, nobody knew anything else. You can only crave what you can imagine, and what people imagined wasn't a room at 23 degrees C with gentle airflow. They imagined shade that doesn't bake your skin, water that isn't warm, or a breeze that doesn't immediately disappear. These were attainable dreams. Air conditioning wasn't. There was another layer to this expectation. Suffering had meaning. In many cultures, enduring heat was framed as strength, discipline, or moral fortitude. The ability to withstand discomfort reflected resilience. A person who complained too much was considered weak, childish, or lacking in self-control. Even religion reinforced endurance. Many belief systems interpreted environmental hardship as part of the human condition, something to be accepted with humility. Heat wasn't an error in the system, it was the system. Philosophers wrote about the virtues of hardship. Elders reminded everyone that their ancestors endured worse. Survival, not comfort, was the highest goal. And then there was work. Almost every occupation, from shepherding to smithing to baking to building, required labour in environments that produced heat or amplified it. Heat at work wasn't a surprise, it was the job. Metalworkers, cooks, farmers, brickmakers and porters expected their days to be brutally hot. They didn't hope for cool conditions, they hoped to stay conscious. Finally, society didn't measure life by comfort, but by continuity. If people endured last summer's heat, they would endure this summer's. If crops survived, families survived. Everything else was secondary. In this context, heat stopped being an event and became a rhythm. Summers rolled in, rolled over everyone, rolled out again, year after year, generation after generation. The misery never changed, so neither did the response. Endure it. Adjust your expectations, sweat and move on. There is a strange comfort in this normalization. People weren't tortured, they were acclimated. Not physically perhaps, but mentally. They didn't deny the misery. They just didn't question it. The good news, everyone endured it. The bad news, everyone always had and always expected to. When we look back at the long, sweaty history of human existence, the naps taken out of necessity, the narrow streets built for shade, the rituals begging the sky for mercy, the hand fans that doubled as wrist workouts, it becomes clear just how recently comfort entered the human story. For thousands of years, heat wasn't an inconvenience. It wasn't an annoyance. It wasn't something you talked about while adjusting your thermostat. Heat was a seasonal adversary that shaped architecture, labour, clothing, culture, religion, and daily survival. People didn't beat the heat. They endured it. And then, almost overnight in historical terms, humanity invented a series of miracles. Ice on demand, electric fans, climate-controlled rooms, insulated walls, refrigeration, evaporative coolers, and air conditioning units that can drop the temperature of an entire house with the push of a button. We didn't outsmart the sun, we simply learned how to ignore it. Today you can walk from a 40-degree street into a perfectly chilled supermarket and experience the emotional whiplash of modern privilege. You open your freezer and summon ice like a minor deity. You sit beneath a fan and demand more airflow at the press of a button. You cool entire buildings instead of cooling your body. You sleep in comfort, you work in comfort, you complain in comfort. And this might be the greatest historical irony. Humans now have more tools than ever to escape heat, and yet our tolerance for it has plummeted. For ancient people, heat was a fact of life. Your body adapted, your expectations adapted, your entire worldview adapted. Today we expect comfort as the default. The moment the air conditioner breaks, panic begins. The moment the power goes out, society collectively wilts. The moment you step into a warm car, you declare yourself seconds from death. Previous generations walked through deserts, stone cities, courtyards, and open fields with grit, endurance, and sweat as constant companions. Today we get annoyed when the mall's AC isn't strong enough in the shoe department. This isn't to say modern people are weaker. We simply live in a world where comfort is the standard rather than the reward. We've forgotten what normal humane heat endurance feels like, because we don't need it anymore. Entire industries exist to ensure we never feel what our ancestors felt every day by 11 a.m. We don't build courtyards for cooling. We build them for aesthetics. We don't sleep on rooftops. We install insulation. We don't migrate for cooler air. We schedule vacations. We don't pray for rain. We refresh the forecast app. Heat used to shape our lives. Now it shapes our complaints. Modern humans stand at an interesting intersection of gratitude and amnesia. We have technologies our ancestors would weep to see. Ice cubes, cold drinks, breezy bedrooms, shaded cars, chilled offices, and fans that don't require the strength of a blacksmith's forearm. We don't just escape heat, we eradicate it from our personal environments. The idea of sweating indoors feels offensive, and yet despite all this progress, people still experience heat as a crisis, not because the heat is worse, but because the contrast between comfort and discomfort is now so stark. When you live at 22 degrees C all day, stepping into 35 degrees C feels like punishment. When you're used to perfect climate control, the natural climate feels wrong. We forget that for most of human existence this was life. Modern heatwaves still challenge us, of course, especially as climate patterns shift. But we meet them with resources unimaginable to past generations. Emergency cooling centres, bottled water, weather alerts, fans, ice machines, clothing designed to wick sweat, and the ability to track heat indexes hour by hour. We still sweat, but we sweat with options. And yet, in a way, we also lose something. Our ancestors possessed a mental endurance that modern life rarely demands. A tolerance built through necessity, routine, and shared experience. They developed communal rhythms around heat, collective coping strategies, and cultural wisdom that helped people persevere through relentless seasons. We've replaced that with the expectation that suffering should not exist at all. But perhaps the greatest reflection is this. Humans today survive heat differently, not better. Technology shields us from discomfort, but it also distances us from understanding our own limits, what our bodies can tolerate, what our minds can adjust to, what communities can endure together. The past reveals that humans are capable of far more than we think when comfort disappears. So we end this journey with a final simple truth. The good news? You have fans, ice, and electricity. The bad news? You still complain, just increasingly indoors while perfectly cooled.